control panel to allow all attendees to hear you. This system will notify you once you begin your broadcast.
Caitlin?
Yes. Can you hear me now?
Yeah, I can hear you now. All right.
Okay.
Then Mike will go ahead and get started.
All right, thanks, Tony. Good morning, everyone. I'd like to open the Atlantic States Shad and River Herring Management Board. I'm Mike Armstrong from the Commonwealth of Massachusetts, for chair. We've got a few things to cover today, the main ones being the review of the benchmark Shad assessment and considering state proposals to resolve inconsistencies. We have a decent length of time, so I think we can probably get through all this stuff without killing ourselves. But we'll move right along. So you all have a copy of the agenda. Are there any changes, additions that anyone would like to see? Any hands, Tony?
Sorry about that. No hands.
All right, seeing none, the agenda is approved by consensus. You have the proceedings from October 2019. Any revisions necessary?
I don't see any hands.
Seeing none, the proceedings are approved by consensus. At this point, we will solicit public comment. And again, as we always say, items that are not going to be discussed later. So things on the assessment or state proposals to resolve inconsistency are not what we want to hear right now. Does anybody have a public comment on something other than things on the agenda?
And just a reminder to the public, you need to raise your hand by pushing the hand button if you want to speak. And if you're having trouble with that, you could shoot us a question or a chat. Mike, I don't see any hands raised.
All right, thank you, Tony. In that case, we'll forge on, which brings us to consideration of the 2020 Shad benchmark stock assessment. This is an actionable item. At the end of all this, we will need to accept the assessment and the review for management purposes. So the first is the presentation of the stock assessment report, and that's by Mike Bailey. Take it, Mike.
Good morning, Mike. Thank you. This is Mike Bailey from the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. I served as the chairman for the benchmark stock assessment. And I will. It's about a 20-minute presentation, so I'll get started. So 2020 American Shad benchmark stock assessment. Here is our favorite fish, just to start off. Next slide, please. So just for a brief outline, I'm going to go through the stock structure, talk about life history information and some of the data we collected, the assessment methods and methodology, and then we'll talk about the stock status and the conclusions from this benchmark. So stock structure, we had about 104 unique rivers stocked from river basins. Out of those, about 23 systems, we actually had information to start the assessment. Each individual river was considered its own stock because of natal homing and some genetic differences. We used 3 regional metapopulations to share life history information. The species has a cline of Iteroparis versus Semoparis, and we use that as part of the breakups. A lot of this was work based on genetic information. We have the northern Iteroparis population, which is north of the Hudson River up to the Canadian border and beyond. We have the southern Iteroparis population north of the Cape Fear River up to the Hudson River, and then a Semoparis from the Cape Fear River down to Florida. And all of those fish only spawn once and then die, as opposed to the Iteroparis fish, which will spawn more than once. We did use some coastwide metapopulation analysis for mixed stock data sets, including coastwide trawl samples and some other samples in which we simply don't know which stock those fish are coming from. Next slide, please. I'll just show you a series of slides. These are actually slides of river systems we use in the habitat modeling section. All of the red dots are dams on those river systems. So this is the northern Idaho-Paris section where we have data from the Merrimack Bay, Merrimack, Pawcatuck, and Connecticut. Next slide, please. This is includes most of the the southern Idaho-Paris population. So fish that spawn more than once but less than north. So we have down from the Hudson down to the Neuse River. Next slide, please. And from the Cape Fear River down to the St. Johns River, we consider these all semiparis populations in which they spawn once and then die after spawning. Next slide, please. So for a life history snapshot, we looked at growth. We used a Bayesian hierarchical von Bert growth model. We used, again, when we didn't have great data in any particular river system itself, we were able to share within those three larger grouping sections that we just talked about. So we shared within those metapopulations. We did use some look at climate and looked at climate at sea to see how the changing temperatures at sea could change the maximum size and growth according to some climate projections going out to 100 years. For natural mortality, we used the THEN estimator, which is an update of Honig 1983, which was used in the previous stock assessment. So that's looking at natural mortality based on the maximum age of any given population of fish. The maximum age was 13 for northern and southern Idaho-Paris populations. And for the semiparis populations, it was a maximum age of 9, both giving different natural mortalities. The maturity schedule, we looked at ogives, which is how often fish are going to come back and at what age they come back to the river to get a better idea. We used a slightly different methodology there, looking at the number of virgin spawners, so the first time fish came back, and then use the natural mortality estimators to look at how often they would come back in the future. We did not use looking at spawning checks, which was used in other assessments, because our spawning checks for American shad, we didn't have a whole lot of faith that those were great checks of when fish actually came back. We had very little data from fish at sea. So with shad, we have a pretty good, some rivers have a good estimates of yoy, young of year, when they're still in the river, but then you don't hear from them again until they come back to the ocean. So they come back to the river to spawn. So we have some big gaps out at sea, which we'll mention numerous times during the stock assessment. Next slide, please. For data, indices of abundance, we had 21 fisheries dependent surveys and 65 fisheries independent surveys. Some of those surveys were young of year indices within river. We had several run count indices in which from either fish ladders or fish weighs. And then we had a lot of CPUE, so catch per unit effort surveys. Just as an example, here's a Hudson River young of year survey looking at larger populations back in the 80s and 90s to the point where we are today, in which the index is significantly smaller. Next slide, please. We have some catch data, although with the closure of some fisheries, we have a little bit less catch data than we had in previous stock assessments. We have system-specific commercial data landings when possible. We have total mixed commercial landings, both US and Canada. The histogram on the right is all reported US commercial landings, both riverine and ocean. We have pretty limited recreational catch for the entire time series, so we don't use that for much at all. The plot with the error bars is American shad total incidental catch and discard catch from the late 80s to 2017. Just to note on that, midwater trawl fleets were included starting in about 2005. Next slide, please. Age compositions of fish, especially for shad, comes up a lot. It's difficult to age shad. We have about 18 data sets representing 12 different systems. So we have several systems that have both scales and otoliths. Otoliths are generally better for determining age. You do have to sacrifice the fish to get those otoliths out. Spawning check marks were imprecise, more imprecise than age data, and they were not used in the assessment for very much, except for some very minor issues. If you look at the figures, those are the CVs from comparing scale age estimates to known age fish on the left and otolith estimates to known age fish on the right. So you can see the coefficient of variation for otoliths is much smaller. More precise data gives us an idea that those otoliths are much more precise and better to use. Some scale reading can be used, and it can get to a pretty tight coefficient of variation, although not all the time, certainly not as often as otolith ages. Next slide, please. So habitat was something that we tried to tackle with this benchmark to a higher degree than it had been done in the past. So we looked at the riverine habitat area. This was based largely on expert opinion and with GIS models looking at the idea of how big of a river shad are looking for. So what we did was we looked at historic habitat prior to barriers put in. We looked at currently unobstructed habitat, and then we ran kind of the pre-dams, post-dams. We ran some population models to look at some of the population size and estimates of fish that we don't have coming back because of the lack of habitat. That is something that that I think we put a lot of work into for this benchmark, and is really took a lot of hands to lift that. So I appreciate certainly some of the habitat work. So that's kind of what we have for data for the assessment methods. How we went about it was we did multiple different things, one of which was looking at power analysis. When I'm talking about that, I'm talking about kind of the signal versus the noise. So we were able to look at abundance data sets and look at trends over time periods. And doing that power analysis, we were able to look at, hey, will you be able to see a change if a change occurs, looking at kind of your baseline data you've been collecting and the variation about that. So we were able to evaluate uncertainty and provide a basis for improvement to monitoring programs. So the big question there is, are you collecting good enough data that you'll actually be able to see if there's a change? Another thing we did was trend analysis. We used Man-Kendall for detecting trends in abundance, mean length, and mean length at age. We also used then ARIMA models to compare recent abundance to reference abundance points. And those Man-Kendall abundance trends, time period at a certain start year and then moving forward, the ARIMA kind of our change of abundance set was 2005. 2005 is when the coastwide ocean intercept fishery was closed. So you'll see in the results, we used 2005 as kind of that change point to see when we expect to start seeing changes. Next slide, please. I'm sorry, next slide, please. That's what I just talked about, sorry. The assessment methods, again, we did a per recruit analysis. We used estimates of spawning potential under various total mortality levels relative to baseline spawning potential, so kind of our baseline mortality there. We provided reference points for total mortality using a Z%. Most of those data inputs there were for life history information for any particular river. We selected Z40 as a threshold for American shad mortality. That total mortality results in 40% of spawning stock biomass per recruit of natural mortality. Z40 is more conservative than the threshold used in previous assessments, which was Z30. The more conservative threshold is appropriate given published simulation analysis. And really, a big part of that is the poor data poor characterization for many American shad stocks, and the uncertainty of resilience of the species due to many different anthropomorphic impacts. Next slide, please. We also used total mortality estimators, catch curves, to get an idea of abundance, of mortality, I'm sorry. Estimates of total mortality were based on the decline of abundance across subsequent age classes. The data inputs for these models were mostly age compositions. So we were able to compare the Z threshold reference points to determine mortality status. We used the last 3 years, so 2015, 16, and 17 of those Z estimates to compare to see if we had sustainable or unsustainable mortality. This is an example of using the Hudson River spawning stock hull seine electrofishing surveys to look at instantaneous mortality over time to see if it's above or below that Z line. Next slide, please. We also used the delayed difference model, which is a biomass dynamic model that allows for a lag in recruitment to exploitable biomass. We had some extra help with having some experts on this model in the peer review, which helped us change this a bit from how we originally had it to post peer review and get some better answers from using this delayed difference model. Estimates of exploitation time series, so fishing and exploitation resulting in maximum sustainable yield, which is what we compared it to. The inputs for this model were catch, index of abundance, and life history information. And again, we applied the stocks with active fisheries to determine the mortality status from those last 3 years of data we used, the 2015, 16, and 17, to indicate mortality. Next slide, please. We were able to, for the first time with Shad, use a statistical catch at age model for both for 2 systems, the Albemarle Sound and the Potomac River. These are more advanced models that in the past we haven't had good enough data to use. We used it's a forward projecting population model that estimates recruitment, spawning stock biomass, and mortality. It integrates the comprehensive suite of data and can separate mortality from direct anthropomorphic stock removals. These removals can include fishery removals and fisheries plus. In terms of the Potomac, they also have a broodstock program which removes some fish. So we were able to look at that as well. The data inputs are, again, this is a hungry model that needs a lot of data. We used index of abundance, total catch, age composition, and life history information. This estimates a per recruit reference point internally, including the spawning stock biomass-based reference points for model estimate recruitments. So again, we're using that Z40 to look at if it's sustainable mortality and looking at the spawning stock biomass to indicate if it's a depleted stock or an overfish stock. Next slide, please. So that was just a quick background. I will say this is a large document and there's a lot of information in it. So I'm just trying to touch on some of the highlights. So looking at the results, the power analysis, our signal versus noise assessment. This is going to be an important tool for fisheries managers to allow for future planning and sampling. Folks will be able to look at that and see if their current sampling with the current variability about that sampling is going to actually allow them to see if there's a change, in which we've set some of the change, what we're looking for in the model. So this is something that I think a lot of folks are going to go back after looking at this and decide, hey, are we sampling correctly? Do we need to augment our sampling? Do we need to do more? Do we need to do less? That's something we're happy that's going to be a tool for fisheries managers to use. Next slide, please. In our abundance trend, again, the power analysis, about 57 of 65 indices were unable to detect trends over 10 years at the threshold we set. So again, this is an opportunity to reevaluate. Are you going to be able to see trends with your current data collection systems, and how should you change those? Some of the adult trends, since 2005, we had 4 increasing trends, 0 decreasing trends. This is from the Van Kendall. 11 with no trends, and 7 with conflicting trends. So a lot of variation since that 2005 benchmark kind of threshold we set to look at changes over time. The young of year indexes, again, pretty mixed up and down trends, mostly with no trends, or data sets that don't have enough data to give us a trend. So there is no consistent response in coastwide metapopulation abundance after that ocean intercept fisheries was closed in 2005. Next slide, please. We were able to get some abundance status trends as well. The Hudson stock is depleted. So this is a qualitative determination for the Hudson and the coastwide metapopulation based on historical landings and indices of abundance. When we had historic landings and indices of abundance, we felt like we could give the status of an individual river system. The Albemarle Sound determination was based on comparison of projected per recruit reference points in model estimators recruitment, and that was not overfished. Next slide, please. One thing to note is only adult mortality levels could be determined from the available data. We don't have young of year indices in any of our rivers to get good enough ideas of juvenile mortality. 3 stocks are experiencing unsustainable adult mortality. Those are the Connecticut, the Delaware, and the Potomac. All 3 of these stocks are managed according to management programs, sustainable fisheries plans. So 5 stocks are experiencing sustainable adult mortality. The Hudson, you'll notice, we've already talked about, is a depleted. So although they're having sustainable adult mortality, they're under recruitment failure. So that's, I just want to mention that. It's a little misleading there. And a bunch of these rivers are under sustainable fisheries management plans. The James, York, and Rappahannock are, under a bycatch plan. So one thing we did note here when it comes to mortality status is, although we have the 3 stocks are experiencing unsustainable adult mortality, that is not necessarily fishing mortality. That may be under other types of mortality, not simply F. But there's other anthropometric adult mortality that's probably including into those factors. Next slide, please. So habitat assessment and simulation modeling, this is what I mentioned before in some of the methodologies. We were able to, with expert opinion and GIS modeling, get into a situation in which we can look at the first setup there is spawning runs with habitats 1, habitat 2, habitat 3. Those are just different units in an undammed river. And we have population models that can look at that scenario of all of the river being opened. The next setup there is a dammed river in which there's no passage at all. So we can look at the habitat section that has no dams on it and no increased mortality from upstream or downstream mortality at those dams. And then we have our current setup, which is the third scenario here, in which we have habitat 1 before a dam. We have an idea of how many fish can be there, and then we model looking at pretty positive passage rates to look at how those fish move up and down. So that's kind of our current state modeled throughout the coast to get an idea of how many fish come up and down there. Next slide, please. And with that habitat assessment and simulation modeling, the current is modeled with very optimistic upstream and downstream passage rates of about 50% upstream passage per dam, all the dams, 80% passage downstream for adults, and then juveniles have a 90% survival as well. So those are optimistic from a lot of the empirical data sets out there. Next slide, please. So the simulation analysis showed habitat restrictions are a major impediment to spawning potential, and that optimistic passage scenarios only offer modest gains in spawning potential. So with those, the current setup, we still have very limited and reduced spawning potential. The dams at those optimistic passage only gives about a 4% increase in the spawning potential. Next slide, please. I know this is very small, but maybe some of you can point out your favorite river here, and we can see some of the black bars with the current available area downstream of the first dam, and the white bars are the total potential for the river, and that is based on a GIS estimate of habitat to look at. So the historic habitat prior to anthropomorphic barriers is certainly much higher. Currently, there is a lot of rivers with a lot of obstructed habitat. 45% of the historic habitat is currently obstructed. Again, this was a lot of work put in by expert opinion on some good modelers that really gave us the first step back look at habitat for a lot of this on a coast-wide basis. And you can see some of those white bars are quite large, meaning that there's a lot of habitat that is no longer available for shad. Next slide, please. So the conclusions. Habitat loss due to barriers is likely restricting positive response in the coastwide metapopulation abundance. We have poorly characterized additive mortality because of dams. We have many situations in which, as a group, we were debating looking at fishing mortality and saying how much of this is fishing versus how much of this is habitat and dam related. So our F's and our Z's started to blend together, which was difficult, and we talked about quite a bit in the assessment. Habitat access is leading to a reduction of ability fish to be harvested either commercially or recreationally. So I think habitat is a key to this benchmark stock assessment. Adult mortality was determined to be unsustainable for some system-specific stocks, indicating continued need for action to reduce adult mortality. We need to have the ability to decouple fishing, recreational, commercial, and bycatch and other anthropomorphic causes. Juvenile mortality during the life stage in the ocean between leaving the river and coming back as mature adults is simply unknown. Even in cases where adult mortality was determined to be sustainable, overall stocks sustainability can be compromised if juvenile mortality is too low. So we still have a black box of sea out there that we don't have a good idea of all of those juvenile fish. And the fish that have already spawned once and go back out to sea. We just don't do that. The assessment doesn't rule out bycatch impacts on stock response, but it does provide definitive link between stock trends and bycatch levels, which again, there's a lot of uncertainty in those bycatch impacts. Next slide, please. So looking forward, that unknown juvenile mortality is still a major limitation that we need a lot more information about. There's almost no information collected, as I mentioned, on those juvenile fish. Another aspect is stocks at sea are mixing, and we don't have a good idea on if we do sample juveniles at sea to understand which stock they're coming from. That stock composition data are essential to improving assessment of American shad. We now have, since the last stock assessment moving forward, we have much better genetic baseline that will allow for some of those juvenile samples collected at sea to be brought back to a natal river with a lot of work that can be done. And that is something that before the last stock assessment wasn't possible, but now we're moving up to that phase. Next slide, please. So the stock assessment subcommittee just kind of wanted to throw some names out there. I could point to everyone and say what they've done, but that would take up a good chunk of the day. It was a pretty dedicated group that did a lot of work for this benchmark, and I'm pretty happy with the result. Next slide, please. And certainly all of the tech committee and some people came in and came out over the time period. I'm sure I left some people out, but this is kind of other folks to thank as well. One thing that we did reach out and ask for some short timelines on was that expert opinion on habitat modeling, so we appreciate that. We were also able to get some information on Canadian stocks, which we previously hadn't gotten to the degree we got. So those were some great things moving forward. And again, ASMFC staff did a lot of work on preparing the actual report. Those large documents are nothing fun to wrestle with, and we appreciate that quite a bit. Next slide, please. And that concludes it for the big overview of the Shad benchmark.
All right, thank you, Dr. Bailey. I think what we're going to do at this point is forego questions and hear the peer review report first. But before doing that, I'd like to thank the committee from the board. That is quite a tome you guys created, and it's just a stunning amount of work by dozens and dozens of people in it. And we'd like to thank you for the effort. I mean, with striped bass, you're assessing the stock, actually 2 stock. With this, you're doing, 23 separate stock assessments. Amazing amount of work. Thank you for everything you put into it, and the whole crew worked on that. So before questions, I'd like to bring up Dr. Karen Lindberg to present the peer review of this assessment. Dr. Lindberg.
Hey, Dr. Armstrong, how are you?
I'm good. How are you?
I'm okay. I'm okay on the fringe of the hurricane. I was told I would be able to share my own screen, so I'm hoping that the magic is happening. Good morning, everybody, and good morning, commissioners, and good morning to all the other folks here. I thought I would be on camera, so I actually put on my favorite fish shirt, which, if you use a little imagination, they look like shad. But anyway, we'll just go with the PowerPoint here. So this is actually my 4th peer review chairing, and I've done American shad before, actually. So let me just put this into show mode. Hope all of you can see this okay. And if you do have questions, you guys can, either ask afterwards, or I think that's probably the most efficient way to do it. I like this image from Denton, I think his name was Charles Denton, was a marvelous artist and created many very nice fish prints. And I think the shad one is one of the finest, of course, unbiased. Just for background, I did my PhD work at Cornell in a period of pretty good shad abundance. And I studied the young of year actually, and their movement out of the system. And so I know shad reasonably well. This is what the team looks like, the faces here. So we had a really interesting group of folks. Jamie, and well, let's put it this way, Craig and I think you would say are the more or less pure fish ecologists. Jamie, Mark, and Kwong are modelers. Jamie's kind of also gets out in the field quite a bit too. I think Mark may as well. You notice that I'm a mycophile. That is a real trophy morel that I'm holding in my hand, not to compete with Craig over there with his salmon. But the three in the middle are from the West Coast. Jamie and I are East Coast. And I'll also point out that Jamie and I think, are the only two people around from any of the parties who were there before, including, I think, the commissioners who were involved with the stock assessment in 2007. So Jamie and I are the institutional memory of that. So because of that, I put in a little bit of comparisons with previous assessment. So the process of assessment, we had this new one. This was the first, as I mentioned, since 2007, so 13 years later. We had the first virtual peer review workshop. So we were on GoToMeeting for most of a week doing this, and I'd say it went pretty well. It's not quite the same as face-to-face in person, but next best, I guess. So the review that we did looked at the data inputs, the model results, and all of those kinds of things, and the overall quality of the assessment. And Mike rightly pointed out that this was a monster assessment, and it is really a credit to the dedication and the hard work and quality of the team that the stock assessment team that put this together. So I want to give you guys a little bit of context on this. I know it's something that nowadays is sort of forgotten, and I don't know what you commissioners think about this, but the American shad was the #1 fish aside from cod through much of American history. And in fact, it was so important that in the 1800s, it was one of the top, if not the top species of fish that was developed in aquaculture because it was such a desirable fish. As it says here, it stands in very high, if not among the head of luxuries, which are rivers afford. This was the first article in the Transactions of the American Fish Cultural Association, which was renamed the American Fishery Society, which is the world's largest professional association of fisheries biologists and managers and everybody else. So it was really a tremendously important fish, and it's kind of been forgotten now because of a phenomenon that you may have heard of called the shifting baseline, whereas as populations decline over time for one reason or another, we humans are very adaptable and start moving on to other things, so it sort of gets forgotten. So the question is, so these are data which Mike Bailey also showed from fisheries catches. So of course, catch statistics may be driven not just by the abundance of fish, but by people's preferences and other factors, weather and so on. But there's a remarkable trend in here, I think, and this is a 5-year trend line, sort of smooths it out, and you can sort of see. Can you guys see my arrow on the screen? It shows what we're seeing here are almost like stanzas where this is sort of leveling down. And although You know, I can't definitively say it's because there are fewer fish. We are very likely at historic lows of American shad, or they're moving north, which is a possibility too. But the thing that really gives me pause is, and I was tipped off really by Jim Cummins, who I saw is attending here today too. He's a tremendous historian of the Potomac, and he had pulled together some data for the 2007 assessment, which showed that the Potomac was actually very full of shad in the early 1800s. And so if we plot those data, and here they've been, what I'm showing is something that's normalized from or sort of standardized to landings per river kilometer. What we can see is that the baseline of 1950 or the 60s and 50s is so much less than just one river in the early 1800s. So we have a rough idea that we are in a very different regime now, and where our changes are today are almost unnoticeable when you scale it up to what was here historically. I also want to point out that shad back in the 1940s, when this National Geographic article came out, were visibly larger than they are today too. I mean, we can show some nice pictures of big shad, but they're really not like they used to be, and that's also something that comes out in the assessment report. Overall, the peer review accepted and passed the assessment, so I want to just get that up front, as we did in 2007. These are the terms of reference that we had, what I call the marching orders. We were asked to evaluate the choice of the stock structure. I assume that these are fairly standard or more or less standard terms of reference, looking at the thoroughness of the data collection, how all the various data were used and treated and presented, the methods and biological reference points, the models, of which there was an abundance of models. And then for each stock unit, we were asked to look at the best and make recommendations on best estimates of biomass, abundance, exploitation. And if for management, although we sort of said that a lot of this was probably, we would be hesitant to use all of it for that, but if possible, so, you know, specify alternative estimation methods. And then also examine the choice of reference points and the methods that were used to determine them, and then look at the stock status determination. And then also finally review the whole set of recommendations that were provided by the technical committee, and then make any additional recommendations as well. I'm not going to be able to go through all of them in this talk, in this presentation. The TC and the review panel both made a number of recommendations. The technical committee had a whole slew of them. It's a great list, and then we added to that as well, which all of these are in the report. I wanted to show you this is something I showed in 2007. And this was to show what kinds of data were being used at that time. I think they actually broke the system up into something like 30 stocks instead of 23 that time. And what you should see here is that there's a lot of blanks. There's a lot of X's, which are unreliable data or deemed unreliable. And there were many fewer black dots of things that were used, which were mainly commercial fishery data or adult data. There was some juvenile abundance information too, but really it was sort of sparse. There was some information on dams, but not really, that was sort of more or less a footnote. So the kind of information that was available then was not, you know, one of the things that the technical committee and stock assessment committee knew at the time was that this was not a stellar data set. And I think that perhaps the shad and river herring folks since then have been laboring under a feeling of not having enough, and now I think they've actually got quite a lot. Then to compare that to today, yes, there are some blanks in here, but some of them are because there just aren't fish passage facilities on a lot of these systems, so there's no way to count things on a facility that doesn't exist. But there are many more data. Data sets are much improved from before. I want to make that point because I think the states have really been putting in effort on this, and that's a very, very commendable. No, the system has everything. I guess that's something we want to strive for. I can also point out that age determination, which is kind of a fundamental thing we need for understanding a lot of processes in the biology and natural history of shad, as well as basically most other fish species. We see that mostly there are a lot of S's in this column. S stands for scale, and scales are just not generally as easy to use to determine age of fish as their otoliths. And as Mike Bailey pointed out, otoliths, you have to kill the fish to use them, but they are definitely better. And it happens to be one of my very arcane skills to do a lot of work with otoliths. So if you look me up, you'll see a lot of my recent work is on a lot of otolith work. These are just some pictures so that you get a feel for what we're talking about here. So here are some scales. These are some scales of American shad on the left. And what you can see here are, as I point out with the arrows, are spawning checks. And those are actually made because the scales actually have some calcium in them. And as the fish are running up the rivers, they're probably mining the calcium out, and the scales actually erode. There may be other reasons why they erode too, but that's certainly one of them. And they'll erode and then get kind of raggedy. And then as they go back out to sea and they feed and grow some more, the scales start putting on new growth, and they leave that check. Which is actually very nice. I mean, these are like logbooks, right? So we get sort of an idea. Each fish is sort of telling you it's the story of its life, and and then otoliths, as I said, are a lot easier to use to age shad, although they're not completely easy. I would say that the clarity of the rings, which you can sort of see here in this image, do get clearer as you head northward. Probably has some kind of a temperature thing, and as you look at them further south, they're kind of muddier to look at. Trust me, I've looked at them. But you can get age information, and my own specialty is to examine chemical composition of otoliths too, and we can get a huge amount of very interesting information from the chemistry as well, although it's still a research front in many cases. But we can use them. For example, we can look at, in many systems, we can look at the strontium that's embedded in the calcium carbonate of the otolith and get a very clear idea of their movement in and out of salt water. So that's really, we can look at migration histories that way. So I wanted to talk a little bit about what I call the modeling and statistical universe here, because there were really almost a dizzying number of models that were used in this analysis. So if we're looking at abundance and size at age, those kinds of things, there were a suite of things that they went through. So power analysis is a statistical technique to ask, is the size of the change in the data big enough to see it over just background statistical noise. And if that was the case, they could look at the autoregressive integrated moving average type model, the ARIMA model, which is a time series technique to see if there are trends. And as Mike said, they were specifically using those to assess the changes since 2005, which was the last real ASMFC action mandate to stop the offshore fishery, directed fisheries. So asking that, and then also they used what's called a non-parametric technique, the Mann-Kendall, to ask more or less qualitatively have the trends been up or down. And those data sets that were used, some of those extended back quite some time, some were, so that they were of variable length. For biomass, the amount of tissue that's produced out there, they were looking at different ways of doing it. If there was no age structure data, or if it wasn't so good, they employed these delay difference models, which Mike discussed. Otherwise, they used models that could take advantage of age structure, and they fall in a class called the Thomson-Bell spawners per recruit. How many spawners are produced per recruit? For total mortality, they employed a technique called catch curves. Some people don't like them, or some experts don't like them, but they are really, often very often used. And I will say that the stock assessment committee use them very carefully and assess them very carefully. They went through, I think they went the extra mile to assess them by looking at different ways of calculating them, for example. If you have really data-rich information for a river stock, including fishing data, then they could go forward with these so-called age-structured assessment models as well. And Mike also talked about those. So that's what I call kind of the universe. So as we were reading through the entire report, you have to sort of bear in mind that there are these many moving parts of it. And then on top of that, there were two new modeling approaches which hadn't been even considered, I think, in the previous assessment at all. But we're certainly, these, I think, are probably the result of the thinking and the mood from the 2007 assessment. One was that inland habitat modeling, which Mike alluded to, looking at the impacts of dams on the systems. And the other was to try to address the ocean mixed stocks. The fisheries in particular, although I threw in this shark to remind us that shad are, of course, subject to natural phenomena like predation as well. So we're not the only mouths out there going for fish. I also wanted to summarize the findings, and I wanted to compare nowadays findings for the status of the stocks against the 1998 benchmark, which was reported on in the 2007 assessment, and also, or just for comparison, and then also the 2007 itself. And what we have are hopefully the symbols that make it somewhat clear that things that are sort of yellow are kind of stable. Things that are green, smiley faces, are sustainable and increasing, and then the sad faces are declining or unsustainable. Question marks mean that there's just not determined. And what we see is that for the 2007, things were looking kind of not necessarily so great. And I think this certainly put some caution into people as they went forward. And then in 13 years later, the status was broken up into two items, the total mortality and the abundance. And what we can see is that total mortality, I made some of these smiley faces a little smaller and shaded them a little bit less red, because these indicate that the assessments showed that the the total mortality was unsustainable in only the most recent years. which was one of the things that the committee looked at, versus longer term. And we have many systems where we just don't still know what that is like. The Hudson, I want to point out, is listed as having sustainable mortality, but I put it sort of a little smaller with a slightly paler shade of green, because honestly, the population levels are very, very low right now. So I think that it's indicating, I think that it's stable. But as has been said, the Hudson's abundance is depleted, so I put a crying face on here instead, being the system I know the best. Really, the only other assessment that we have, as was mentioned before, was for abundance, is that the Albemarle Sound from the model was not overfished. And the other systems, again, a tremendous amount of unknown, and it does make me kind of just stepping back and asking, well, here we know more about these stocks than ever, and yet we still can't make these determinations. So I'm not really sure why that really is, but it's something, again, to think about. So just the findings that we accepted the choice of stock structure. It seems pragmatic. We know that the shad spawn in many systems. They mostly have a lot of fidelity to a natal river, like the salmon do. They do some straying, but not as much as they do homing. So we think that the choice was good, and for some of those complex systems, particularly in the south, where there are many rivers that come out in embayments and things like that, that the choices of how to group them was good. We evaluating the thoroughness of the data collection. This is a quote from our report. The review panel was very impressed and a little overwhelmed by the amount of data available for assessing American shad stocks. They were both, the data sets were comprehensive and thorough. There was an acknowledged weakness on the part of the stock assessment subcommittee, that, as you saw before, that many states use scales to age their samples. And we recommend, as they did, the use of otoliths, and I think all states are now collecting otoliths. And I don't want to beat on this too much, but it's knowing how fish age, what that composition is quite important for at least the current way that the assessments are carried out. That all the models really do depend on knowing age. And I can just say that I worked also in the Baltic Sea on cod over there, and they are in such bad shape from really low oxygen problems in the Baltic Sea and other problems too, that they don't even lay down good rings on their otoliths anymore. So we're using other methods to tease out the age from the otoliths instead of looking at rings. Evaluating the models and so on, we were impressed by the number of analytical methods. As I said, there were sort of a dizzying number of methods that were used. We did find that the analyses were complementary too. For the trends, the trends will be followed up, of course, as we go into the future. It was recommended that some of the more advanced time series analyses could be used instead of just looking at ARIMA models. You could use other types that would remove sort of any kind of temporal trend, like an uptick from you can separate out the ups or downs from the other wiggles in the data and look at the other wiggles, just putting it simply. And there are techniques called such as dynamic factor analysis that look for underlying factors. So for instance, there may be some climate driven factors or something else within a large region, like one of the metapopulation regions. So those could be employed too. The committee found that the Thomson-Bell biomass per recruit model wasn't a good model for seminal parastocks. It was designed for these repeat spawner stocks. The other models were deemed to be appropriate, but as Mike mentioned, the delay difference model was modified by one of the experts on the panel. Kwong actually developed some of these models, and so he helped the committee to explore alternate assumptions and add more diagnostics. So that was quite useful. The catch curves, we agreed with the committee, that the subcommittee, that it's very impractical to split fishing from total mortality. And I guess you've heard now from both Mike and myself about the other mortality that happens because of the fishing is one factor in the in the suite of factors that lead to shad dying. So it's difficult not to keep them together, I guess, to split that out. And we discussed the biases in the current method. Jamie Gibson in particular proposed an alternative that incorporates information from spawning history. He was very keen on that. So that's also in our report, but I don't have time to go into it in detail. Then for the age-structured models, these are definitely the most advanced models that were used, and the only systems that really had enough data to conduct these models was the Potomac and the Albemarle Sound, and they were fully explored with various types of analyses and diagnostics. And so the review panel had 3 recommendations. One was that one of these models, the simpler versions of these so-called statistical catch-at-age models, broke down because they didn't account for the availability of shad to actually be caught. And so basically what they were doing was catching fish that shouldn't have been caught. And because they didn't separate out mature fish from immature fish. And this does actually get into something else, which is that immature fish are assumed to be, to remain in the ocean and not run with the mature fish into the rivers where they could be caught. And I know from my own work that that's not always the case. At least I've studied 1-year-old fish, and I know that they go back a lot of times with the spawners. We don't know what fraction of the population it is, but we do know that we can find them coming up from the ocean. So I think it's a nuanced issue that probably bears more research, and also to run simulations under different assumptions of fishing and biomass. And again, getting at this question of where are the immature fish? If they use one of these more advanced models, the stock synthesis model, they could model the immature fish separately from the mature fish. Or even better would be to have a shad-specific model, assessment model. This would, of course, take more time because it would require more data. It would require better estimates of spawning marks. So getting the idea of like how many times do these fish actually go up into the rivers. So that's again it's a long-term goal. It's a very good goal, and I think it would be something that would be wonderful to have some PhD students work on. The habitat modeling, we were impressed with this analysis. We thought that this took the whole assessment up to a different level, and we think it's necessary for diadromous fishes. And we've seen, I having also chaired the reviews of American eel and river herring in 2012, this issue came up then too. But we were told, well, you can't really do much about it because, the only thing that fisheries managers can manage is the fishing level. But we actually think that this is something that can be used, that we now have this information, and we can say, we can make, we or the ASMFC commissioners can make strong recommendations to other stakeholders to remove dams when it's possible. I think there's just a growing body of evidence that dam removal is probably the best thing for improving the sustainability of diatomaceous fishes, and or not to build them in the first place, which is going on in other parts of the world. So I think that's a very important finding that comes out of this, and I do encourage you to consider that. With the ocean mixed stocks modeling, the report noted that the results were extremely variable. The data sets are very variable, but we thought the review panel thought that the approach that was used was the most appropriate. There was an expert from NOAA Fisheries who conducted that analysis, and the panel felt that the estimates would improve with better monitoring of ocean fisheries. And one point I want to make is that Shad really connected dots. All these diatomaceous fishes connected dots between the watersheds and the open ocean. So from the headwaters, which influence a lot of the water dynamics and the land use and the damming and so on, the pollutants that go in, all the way out to the sea. These fish are real connectors, and you know, if you can manage them sustainably and well, it means, I think, that we're dealing with some of our problems in a more appropriate way. So for the estimates of biomass, abundance and exploitation, we felt that this was by and large done well. We did make the point that the delay difference model is not designed to be used on semipara stocks. And we also agreed that the total mortality being highly variable, or the estimates of certainty are not very certain. So wide confidence intervals means that that's the case. So have to be somewhat a little bit grain of salt on this. For reference points, we appreciated the many ways that were done for assessing so many populations and locations. And where status was undetermined, there was still an awful lot of information that was really informative. So it was, I would be reading along in these various river chapters and think, wow, this is really an amazing amount of data. And then at the end, it would say status is unknown. So I think that they're probably close to being able to say something in many of the systems, but I think the subcommittee was hesitant to make a concrete determination often. For the recommendations, there are just many. One I'll just point out myself because I think about this in the context of the Hudson, although not all these predators are in the Hudson, but young of year. Now, Mike Bailey said that very little is known about young of year. I kind of question that because there are so many master's and PhD studies that have focused on shad and river herring. I think it's really getting some of that information really incorporated into stock assessments, maybe where the gap is. But one of the things that I'm increasingly aware of in the Hudson is that we have a suite of really novel introduced predators that have been introduced for either by moving in through connected waterways like the Erie Canal connecting from the Great Lakes over into the Mohawk River, which is a tributary to the Hudson, or through introductions, which are the case with things like the channel cat and the blue catfish on top, which were introduced as sport fish in the south and are moving their way up. Channel cat actually prefers to eat, select some Alicine herrings as prey. Up north, we have more pike. We're seeing more pike. And then, of course, the nasty looking face there is the snakehead, which is making its way through parts of the range as well. So just one of the threats. But there are other things, there are many, many other things that we have recommendations for. All of them are to get an idea of what these fish are doing in their ecosystems, both from the sort of the small scale, fine scale genetics on up to their role in these systems. The other thing to mention is just that we also can't forget that climate change is moving right along. And although this panel comes from the stock assessment report, and I would have really liked to have seen this go back to the earlier decades, because then you really see the changes. But from when, so these are catches at sea from the NOAA fisheries, when you see the changes in the the dynamics of where the shad are being caught has really moved northward. And I think John Hare, who's on this call, I think, and Janet Nye and their colleagues have studied this quite a bit, looking at how many stocks of fishes are moving northward, and shad's certainly one of them. The committee used climate projections. The BAU stands for the business as usual projection, and then with some mitigation, some climate mitigation, looking at the impacts of rising temperatures on the parameters of shad growth. And even with mitigation, we're going to see declines. And as I mentioned, we're already seeing some declines. And whether those are directly from the sort of the metabolic tax of rising temperatures, making fish respire more so they grow less, or if it's changes in the food web or some combination, it's likely to be there. And so it really means that we have to be more precautionary. It doesn't mean we should shut down fisheries where they can be prosecuted, but we just have to think about it more. It's more like I work on ocean deoxygenation as one of my research topics, and there our recommendations are that for coastal systems that are subject to dead zones, that management really has to take care of nutrient management so as not to exacerbate that problem. And it's the same thing here. We just really have to think about it more holistically. So for shad and shad fisheries to be sustainable going forward, we do need to think in that broader context of watersheds to the sea, which I'm very glad to see in this report, and climate change, which I'm glad to see in this report, and continued improvements to monitoring and data. And don't wait, please don't wait another 13 years for the next benchmark assessment. And we've discussed how that could be, that time frame could be shortened up and maybe split apart to ease the burden on the committee. And so thanks for listening to this part of the presentation. I just wanted to end with saying that, shad is an important fish. We forget so often about it, but it's one of my rites of spring. That's John Waldman in the picture. We were fishing in the Delaware this spring where it's legal to take home fish. And so I cooked up some shad roe, which is absolutely awesome, and smoked some shad as well, which is totally awesome too. So if you have questions, I'll do my best to answer. Thanks for listening. And so I need to unshare my screen probably. And I think you're going to have to help me do that.
Karin, we'll be able to take it back from you. Thank you.
Okay.
All right. Karin, thank you so much. That was a great review. But the best part is I just heard you volunteer for a review panel shorter than 13 years from now. So that's awesome. We'll just pencil it in. So if the assessment is daunting, the review is just as daunting, and it appears you had a great panel to work with, and the advice coming out of there is fabulous, and particularly your historic and high-level overview of shad is very, very helpful. And, you know, the perspective of we're at very low levels, even though we look at some runs and say, hey, we're doing good. We're really not doing good across the board. So we have a lot to think about coming out of this. So our first task will be to consider accepting the assessment and the review for management and use. And in preparation for that, I'd like to open up the floor for questions from Mike and Karen or comments on the assessment from the board. So floor is open.
You have questions from Marty Gary, Justin Davis, and then Lauren Lustig. And Mike, I do also know we have questions from members of the public, just as a FYI for later.
Okay, and we'll cover that when the board members are done. Marty Gary.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you, Dr. Bailey and Dr. Lindberg for both all your hard work and also two really spectacular presentations. I understood, I think, most of it, so that was a good highlight for me, and I appreciate everything you put into bringing these forward to us today. I have two questions, and if either of you want to try to respond to them, it would be appreciated. And just a little bit of context, Dr. Lindberg, you applied a green smiley face to the Potomac back in 2007. And for the folks listening and members of the board, a lot of that I assume is attributable to our fishery-dependent bycatch CPUEs, which showed a trend of ever-increasing abundance of American shad in the Potomac. So every year I look forward to getting the new index values updated and media calls coming in. And amongst all the other challenges we have, that was one of the bright spots. And now we have this assessment, which has shed some new light. And so I heard Dr. Bailey say that the Potomac had unsustainable adult mortality, but it may not be attributed strictly to fishing mortality, which could either be, as I understand it, from the bycatch fishery we have for our gill nets and pound nets, or the broodstock collection. And for folks on the board, PRFC typically issues somewhere between 6 and 8 scientific collecting permits to collect brood fish, which are strip spawned and then taken to hatcheries for restoration efforts in other rivers. And this typically happens just down from Mount Vernon and Monticello, hence the founding fish and the importance of shad in the Potomac, but certainly the eastern seaboard. But my questions are, and just one other item, we also, Dr. Lindberg, you mentioned in one of your last slides, predators. I think a lot of folks know we have a huge biomass of invasive blue catfish in the Potomac. And it just so happens the epicenter of their distribution overlaps with where the shad spawn and presumably where the juveniles are using habitat in their early life stages. So I guess the first question I have, and maybe it'll be speculative in your answer, is what do you think is contributing to this unsustainable adult mortality in the Potomac specifically? I know some of the research that's been done in the Potomac and in the Chesapeake has showed that the allicines, predation on the allicines by blue catfish has not been that significant, but I can't help but believe, given the biomass we have, it's having a significant impact on them. And I guess the second question, and it may spill over into our management response dialogue, is the efficacy of the continuity of that bycatch and our fishery-dependent collection of data. Where's the value of that going forward, if there is any? So again, sorry for that this long series of dialogue leading up to those questions, but again, thank you so much for your presentation, and I'll listen.
Mike, do you want to start off?
I think if I'm going to start off, I would introduce Jeff Kipp, who worked on some of the Potomac-specific models. We may tag team that question. There was a bunch of different parts to it, I'll start off by talking about the catfish. And there was a recent paper that came out looking at those two different, I think the blue and the flathead, and showing that while the abundance was higher for the blue, the flathead seemed to really focus in on allicines as a preferred. So they may have had less numbers, but they were looking for allicines more, which is maybe more problematic than just large numbers. It's probably a big mix there, but certainly we did include that because it is an important component. And I think with that, I'll just kind of hand it off to Jeff to talk a bit more about the Potomac model.
Yeah, thanks, Mike. This is Jeff, and just to touch on that research Mike cited on the catfish, the invasive catfish species. It did find that blue catfish are more opportunistic, and so their diet tends to be more proportional to the abundance of prey species in the river. And so, if you take that into mind, as shad abundance would increase, it would become a bigger component of the blue catfish diet. If you look at the trends in abundance that we have, so we have some young of year indices and some adult indices in addition to what Marty mentioned in the CPUE index, you can see a very clear increase in shad abundance in the early 2000s. And then those increases tend to level off. So if you look at the trend analysis on the indices of abundance in the assessment, there were no trends detected since 2005. But if you look over the full time series of those indices, which go back into like the 80s or early 90s, they did find increases in abundance. And so that's mostly attributable to those ramp ups that occurred in the late 90s and early 2000s, but have since leveled off. And so, it could be potentially blue catfish are taking advantage of that increase in abundance that occurred in the early 2000s. But in addition to that, the only other sources of mortality that we know of that are going into those adult mortality estimates out of the age composition data are bycatch mortality, and then the broodstock mortality. And so, we recognize that those broodstock fish are taken for the purpose of improving recruitment and raising those fry, but they don't get the chance to repeat spawn. As Marty mentioned, they're sacrificed, and so they don't have the opportunity to come back. So they contribute to some of that adult mortality. But in addition to that, there's the nebulous additional sources, habitat, what's going on in the ocean bycatch, which we still just don't have a grasp on with the available data, and how much it contributes to each of the individual stocks and their overall mortality. So hopefully that was some good context, but let me know if that didn't fully answer your question.
No, thank you, Jeff. I appreciate that. And then I don't know if it's, if we want to defer this to management responses, but I don't know if any of you can give your thoughts on the value of the fishery-dependent collection of data that we have a pretty long series on now, and where you see that standing going forward.
Well, if I can just jump in, I think any long-term data are important to have. We're facing the issue in the Hudson River system now that some long-term monitoring has ceased, and we are trying to reimagine ways of making it happen again and how that should be. So I think you obviously can't see many phenomena if you don't have some kind of long-term data. So understanding some of the drivers on the data are very important. At fisheries can be from changes can be from behavior. For example, changes in what people like to do or the gear that they use and so on. But I still think it's invaluable to have the data, just personally speaking.
Thank you, Dr. Lindberg, and thank you, Mr. Chairman, for that generous apportionment of time. Thank you.
Okay. Tony, I have Lauren third. I missed the second hand up.
It's Justin Davis, and then after Lauren will be Cherie Patterson.
Okay, Justin, go ahead. Justin Davis.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'll just start by thanking Mike and Karin for two excellent presentations this morning and thanking the Stock Assessment Subcommittee for all the work that went into this document. I've got a two-part question that has to do with these terms, sustainable versus unsustainable mortality, reference to the total mortality reference points. So I think those terms, sustainable or unsustainable, if you ask 10 people, what does that mean? They'd say, sure, I know what that means. But then if you ask them to expound upon that, you might get 10 different answers. So I wanted to provide how I'm interpreting those terms and see if that matches with what the technical folks interpret it as. So I view the idea of unsustainable mortality here as meaning that the stock is experiencing a level of mortality that is preventing it from recovering to a level of abundance that would be typical of that stock under sort of a baseline natural mortality level that's typical of, you know, a fish of this life history and maximum age. But I don't interpret it to mean unsustainable in the sense that we would expect sort of extirpation or local extinction of the stock in some, you know, reasonable time frame, 20 years, 50 years, and that also that level of mortality may not even lead to declines from where the stock is now, that the stock may be able to persist at this level of abundance with maybe a truncated age structure at that level of mortality. So I'm just looking for maybe a little clarification on the interpretation of those terms, sustainable versus unsustainable mortality. And then related to that, what was the rationale for changing the level of, you know, what was defined as unsustainable mortality in this assessment, making it more conservative relative to the past assessment?
Again, I think it's Mike.
Yeah, I think Mike, could you answer that?
Yeah, I think for this one, I'm going to pass it off to Jeff as well.
So yeah, thanks, Mike. Justin, I would say that your interpretation is correct. So we chose a reference point based on the per recruit analysis. So what we're shooting for is a Z40% or a mortality that gives us 40% of the spawners per recruit under that baseline sort of natural mortality you mentioned based on the longevity of the species. So, you know, in theory, this species could stabilize at a lower abundance under higher mortality rates. So it doesn't necessarily mean the unsustainable doesn't necessarily mean that the stock is trending towards extirpation. And then I think the other question was why we chose the Z40% changed relative to the last assessment of the Z30%. And so the Stock Assessment Subcommittee did a review of the literature that are available on these per recruit analyses, which are typically meta-analyses on various stocks and looking at sort of what that sweet spot in mortality is that you want to shoot for. And so after that review, we felt that Z40 was the more appropriate level. It's a bit more conservative, and that's to note sort of the data uncertainties we're dealing with here, and just the uncertainty in this species being at such a low level, what the uncertainty is in those appropriate mortality levels. And so I think it's sort of nodding to the uncertainty here and the precarious state we think a lot of these stocks are currently in, and that we think we should be shooting for something a bit more conservative than was being targeted in the last assessment.
And to add to that, I think some of that increased uncertainty comes from a better understanding of aging of the fish, and certainly we have a lot more quantitative data now that we can say scale aging that was used in previous stock assessments probably was not nearly as accurate or precise as we thought it was.
Yeah, it's kind of a little bit of a black art to age from scales, I think, but.
All right. Moving
Some
on.
people are very good. Some people are very good at it. I will say that some people are very good at aging with scales.
All right. Lauren Lustig.
Yes, thank you, Mr. Chairman, and also thanks to Dr. Limburg for a very fascinating report. I really have two questions, and they relate to historic abundance. Predominantly, I'm interested in the Susquehanna River. I was interested in the photograph that was shown of a commercial angler there with a small skiff and these really large American shad. So my first question is, based upon my own recreational fishing in the lower Susquehanna, is the hickory shad that comes up just up the river just before the American shad, is the hickory shad a species that would have ever been commercially harvested? And I'm interested in knowing if the population of hickory shad shows the same sorts of fluctuations, perhaps based upon riverine habitat quality, as the American shad. And so if it does, then it would be perhaps data that we should consider as we move forward with our American shad assessment. Thank you.
Not sure who wants to take that.
Lauren, who do you think should answer that?
Well, the person with the most knowledge, I would wonder if Dr. Limburg could comment about that.
Okay, I can say that I don't think there's many there. I don't think there's a lot of fishing on hickory shad. There's I remember there was a guy at, I think he was at Virginia Commonwealth, university, who used to study them, and he commented that they weren't very good eating, which surprised me. I've never tried them myself. I've only seen one hickory shad myself. They're not as abundant up north as they are in kind of the mid-Atlantic states, but they may come up, of course, with climate. So I think what I know is that they are kind of recreationally angled, but I don't know that they could. I don't know how much they compete, for example, for habitat with American shad. So I think, again, I think there are a lot of questions, a lot of just open unknowns about them. It's the fate, unfortunately, of the fish that don't produce as much income to be less studied, unfortunately.
Okay. Sherry Patterson, next question.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And this was very informative. I really see a lot of work involvement here, and I'm in awe of the work. Is it possible to go back to Dr. Limburg's presentation where it shows the northward movement of shad stocks?
Yeah. This is, if you can make my screen visible. I don't know if it is or not.
It's not yet.
Okay.
Sherry, if you could ask your question and we'll get you there. It's just going to take us a couple of minutes, so if you could keep asking questions, just keep us moving along.
Okay, great.
Okay.
Thanks.
Do you really need that, Sherry? Can you work around it?
Well, I can try and work around it. So
wave your arms.
My question has to do with this stock assessment. Was there any sort of analyses, and I'm sorry if I missed it, to move some of these data sets, or to think about moving some of these data sets northward. I believe in long-term data sets. I think they're very important. But if they're showing some trends that are not easy to analyze, and it looks like there is a northward movement of this population, how is that going to be analyzed in the future so that we're not necessarily looking at downward trends in all the wrong places, that we might be literally following these species as they're doing this northward movement? You know, I'm just concerned about the habitat and life cycle stresses that might be affecting them in the mid-Atlantic further south and such, and we're not really capturing their northern movement into new habitats. Thank you.
I can take a stab at that. Sherry, I think that was a great question. And I think one of the big questions for me is with regard to these Alaskan herrings that have very broad latitudinal ranges and site fidelity. So we know that they establish these, you know, genetically distinct spawning populations. One of my questions is, are they, and you know, we're only looking at a tiny moment in time over the course of their evolution, and they've been subjected to massive glaciers, glaciation events, and probably warming events and hybridization, and they're very flexible fish evolutionarily. But the question I have in this particular moment is, are the populations just going to be winking out in the south and enlarging, expanding to the north, or are we going to actually see hopscotch movement of populations from the south to the north? And that's the kind of question that can be addressed by genetic analysis, and I believe there is some of that work going to be started. I think it's one of the big questions for these fish, and it matters, I think, quite a lot. I mean, for example, if the hopscotch hypothesis is correct, then perhaps the reason why shad are just about gone in the Hudson might be because they moved north, and maybe we have to wait till southern populations start to colonize. I have no idea. It's an open question. But I think that's probably the approach to asking that is to try to do the genetic work, is my guess. I mean, we from otolith chemistry, we can also identify populations, but I think the kind of I don't know that it would address exactly the questions that you're asking now.
Thank you, Karen. Mike Bailey, would you want to add to that?
It's a hard question, and part of it is the latitudinal gradient of some of the life histories, and also some of the habitat in which more southern rivers typically have a dam much further, goes much further. So I think it's a good question. It's one to think about. To give a great answer, I don't think we can do anything but make up stories right now. It's something to consider, though, with climate change and shifts, not only the freshwater shifts, but also the marine shifts. Right now, we are still a lot of open question to where all of these fish move at sea, and that may be a bigger factor. If fish from Florida have to add an extra 500 miles north in their oceanic journeys, well, that may make a much bigger difference than fish off the Merrimack River have to go. So it's really a confounding question. There's a lot of interesting things to think about it, but I don't think we have any solid answers.
Great, thank you. Tony, more questions from the board?
Yes, we have Bill Hyatt, Lynn Fagley, and Roy Miller, and Emerson Hasbrook.
Okay, let me write those. Okay, Bill Hyatt, please.
Okay, thank you. One of the things that surprised me from this assessment was the fact that current fish passage only for about a 4% or so increase in potential spawning. And that surprised me because it seems that fish passage work is being all over the place. So I would have expected a much higher number. So one of the things that I'm wondering is if there was any assessment done on how much of that maybe lack of improvement is due to inefficiency of existing fish passage facilities. So how much that 4% number might be improved from technological fixes of existing facilities.
Thank you, Bill, for that question. This is Mike Bailey. So in the analysis we did for the coastwide stock assessment, we kept those passage rates static. For most of this work was done by Dan Stitch from University of New York State College of Oneonta and Joe Zedleski from USGS. For different rivers, they have worked with very similar models to look at different passage rates, and they do make a difference, especially adult downstream migration. For this coastwide model, we kept it a bit more simple. And I think if we did increase that number of passage rate, we would see a greater increase, but we didn't run a sensitivity on that, at least that I have at my fingertips, to see how much that 4% could increase. For individual river models, they have it. For this coastwide one, I don't have it at my fingertips.
So there's a potential that's unquantified.
Yes.
Is that good? Okay, thank you.
Okay, let's see, it's Lynn Fegley. Lynn, are you on mute?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I was allowed to unmute by the organizer, so thank you, organizer, for that, and thank you to the peer review, Dr. Lindberg, and to the stock assessment committee. That is a phenomenal amount of work. My question is really basic. You know, this species is so different than other species that we manage, where we have you know, reference points, and we sort of understand what we need to do to manage fisheries relative to our reference points. And our action item today is to accept this assessment for management. And so I'm trying to wrap my head around what that means. You know, so to Justin Davis's question about sustainability, it sounded like, you know, with the Z40 reference point, it puts us in a place where we probably wouldn't be rebuilding. Maybe we would be holding the population stable at this low level, but we would not be extirpating the population. Although then we transition to climate change and we talk about, you know, populations vanishing from areas to the south. So I guess my question is, basically, what does it mean when we accept this for management, and what more could we possibly do? I love the habitat piece because I think it gives us really a platform to work from with our partner agencies and, you know, other folks involved with habitat, as Dr. Lindberg says. But I'm really trying to understand, if someone can help me, you know, if we accept this for management and we have a fishery that has unsustainable levels of mortality on adult fish, what does that mean? Thanks.
Thank you, Lynn. It's such a great question. It really crystallizes a lot of why we're sitting here. And it kind of comes to, do we just want to hold in place, or do we want to actually rebuild, which might be much stricter than what we're thinking about. Why don't we start with Mike Bailey?
That's a hard question, and frankly, my work is more focused on restoration. So I look at this stock assessment from one aspect in which there should be a lot more shad out there. I'm not sure that is. I'm not sure that's what everyone else thinks. So I'm almost gonna skip that question because you know, I think they're, well, I guess that's a question for the board. Are we looking to rebuild shad stocks everywhere, or are we looking to rebuild shad stocks in some rivers, or are we just looking to have better data on those shad stocks? I think that's more of a question for the board than for me, because for me, it's restoration. We need a lot more fish than we have now. We're way below where we should be, and that starts with habitat. In addition to the more restrictive catch measures that's already been, I think the missing piece now is focusing on habitat work and continuing on with those limits to fisheries.
So can I follow up on that real quick? So
Sure.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. So to that point, does that imply that if you were to get that total mortality down below the 40%, that you could begin rebuilding? I guess that's one of the things I'm trying to understand.
Jeff, if maybe you can tackle that question better.
Yeah, so the Z40 threshold is what we think is the appropriate level, and yes, it should allow for rebuilding of this stock, of these stocks, assuming that the juvenile mortality, so when these fish leave as young of year and then come back to spawners, assuming that those mortality levels are sustainable as well, which right now we don't have the data to assess. But you know, in theory, that Z40 would allow for sufficient SSB per recruit to build these populations back to what we think are the optimal levels. So I think we recognize the concern here about what do you do. It's a total mortality estimate, and again, we don't partition these mortality estimates into their individual components because we just don't have the data to do that. So one of the first things I think is that came out of this assessment is to highlight that we need certain data components to be collected. Most notably, I think stock composition data from the ocean. So there is bycatch going on, but we don't know how that bycatch is impacting these individual stocks. It might be impacting some more than other, but we don't have the data to determine that now because we don't know what the stock makeup is of that bycatch. So I think, you know, data collection is one of the emphasis out of this to get us to a place where we can better partition those mortality sources and determine if fishing in a particular river is limiting the rebuilding of these stocks. So I hope that helps address, but yeah, it's a tough question when we don't know what the various factors are doing to these mortality rates. Thank you, Jeff.
If I might jump in also just to say that, yeah, I think this is, I think both Mike and Jeff are right, and that, but remember that we're at such low levels of populations that, you know, a removal is proportionately more than it would be if the populations are really high. So that's why we have to be cautious. And I'm not saying to shut down fisheries, but I'm saying be cautious and think about that. But I think it also gets at Mike's point of, you know, we need to tread on places that we normally haven't trampled, which is talking about opening up habitat. And studied this myself in some of the rivers of the East Coast. And, you know, the biggest difference you could probably make is getting fish up the Susquehanna all the way. So, you know, taking down the Conowingo Dam, the passage doesn't work. I know Sheila Eiler's on this call, and we've had discussions about this. They're doing truck and transfer now, but we know that the most effective way, if we really, really wanted to get fish up and rebuild those populations there, it would be no dams. That would be the way. Now, the Susquehanna has other complications. It's got the Susquehanna, or the Conowingo Pool, is full of sediments that the Chesapeake Bay community doesn't want to have rolling down into the bay. It's got a lot of complicated things going on, but I think it could be managed, but it would take a lot of work and planning.
Been in front of Roy, who's next. Hang on a second, Roy. Mike, is there, related to this question, are there empty rivers that could help build up the population by restoring runs? Are there opportunities on the East Coast to restore runs that we haven't done anything about?
I think there are. I think some of those rivers are, we could take, for example, the Penobscot River, which the first dam at head of tide wasn't passing any fish, so we didn't know what was below that river. I think there's probably a lot of populations below, low on rivers that are populations that still exist that we don't know anything about because they don't pass. I think there's a lot of opportunities in those smaller systems.
Okay, thank you. Roy Miller.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you also to Mike and Dr. Limburg and to the stock assessment staff and everyone who worked on this truly noteworthy assessment. My question, I'm going to apologize in advance because I did lose Wi-Fi for about 30 minutes. And so if I repeated questions that's been asked and answered, I apologize. But I wanted to follow up on the question of Justin Davis, and also Lynn Fagley touched on the same thing regarding these unsustainable populations. I'm specifically referring to the Connecticut, the Delaware, and the Potomac. Of those three, obviously the Delaware is nearest and dearest to my heart, since I used to serve on the Delaware River Fishing Management Cooperative for many, many years. But anyway, if the mortality is unsustainable, let's say in the Delaware, and the Delaware is essentially undammed, get into the hundreds of miles upstream into the headwaters in New York State, so we can ignore dams on the main stem because there aren't any compared to the Susquehanna. What can you do to turn that situation around regarding unsustainable mortality? In other words, would it be a waste of time to further restrict fishing mortality on the Delaware stock, or would it be worthwhile to pursue that now greatly depressed fishing mortality over what it used to be many years ago, or at least harvest compared to what it was many years ago? Is it worth pursuing that last aspect of something we can control, namely fishing mortality, versus other things as yet undefined? And I'm curious what our two reviewers think about that particular question. Thank you.
Great question. Mike, why don't you take a crack at it, then we'll have Karen.
And I will apologize for a second. You broke up a little bit there, but I think I got I think I got the base of the question. While the Delaware does not have dams, it does have some water quality issues in some years that are really left undefined. We don't know how, we don't know that component of oxygen degradation affects some of our adult spawners, including those fish that may be spawning and then leaving later in the year during when water quality is detrimental to health. We don't have that answer. So while and I think that comes down to when we get to a lot of river specific questions, we lose a lot of the specifics of the river and what's actually causing some things. The Delaware, certainly we see fish run way further than a lot of other rivers. And we have to understand those fish that are making it way up in the headwaters, are they able to turn around and make it out of the river with the water quality that it is? And so I think with that, I'll bump it to Karin, but realizing that it depends on what our whammy bar is. If our one whammy bar is fishing, then that's what we have to adjust. If we want to look in that framework of fishing, but our real answer may be something that we don't necessarily have our hand on, which is some of that other mortality that I think classically how these models work may be tied into fishing, but it's not fishing at all. It's more of an environmental factor. With that, I'll let Karin take a swing.
Okay. If I were to put on my hat and play John Waldman, John would say that the commercial fishery in the Delaware Bay should be looked at. He speaks from having studied the stock composition in the Delaware Bay fishery, commercial fishery. When he studied it, I think it was around 2010, 2011, something like that. I think 40 some odd % of the genetic composition of that stock was Hudson River origin. And this also reminds me that this is another thing that might be driving the decline in the Hudson too. I noted in the stock assessment report that there's been a follow-on study of the genetic composition of that fishery, and the proportion of Hudson River fish now is half of what it was when John studied it. So over a something like maybe an 8-year time difference, there was a halving of the proportions in the Delaware. That could mean that the Delaware population has grown more, or it could mean that the Hudson population has shrunk. So I think that it points to something that's got to be looked at more in the case of the Delaware. And I can't really comment on the I'd have to go back and look at statistics on the impact of recreational fishing versus the commercial fishing in the bay. So the recreational, correct me if I'm wrong, folks, but I think a lot of it happens above the bay, and the commercial mostly happens in the bay in that particular case.
If I may follow up, Mike.
Sure.
You're absolutely right, Dr. Lindberg. That recreational fishery is primarily in the riverine portion and much less so in the estuarine portion of the Delaware estuary. In fact, in the state of Delaware, there is no main stem Delaware recreational fishery for American shad. That occurs quite a bit further upstream. In terms of the water quality, I would agree with Mike Bailey that was a huge problem 30, 40 years ago, but I think we've come to grips with that problem over the years, and water quality is much less of an issue for the Delaware stock.
I agree.
In terms of Dr. Lindberg's suggestion, using John Waldman's data to look at commercial harvest in Delaware Bay, that's probably one of the few things that we could do. if we felt that that was potentially important. I'm not convinced that it is, but it's about all we can do to have any potential impact on that stock. But thank you for your thoughts on this.
And if I may add, I think there is some renewed focus on the Delaware. So the questions maybe we're asking now or don't even need to ask now, by the time the next stock assessment comes up, we may have a much better ways to ask the right questions and get to the right answers.
Right, thank you. Emerson Hasbro.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you, Drs. Bailey and Lindberg, for your excellent presentations. My question is, somewhat relative to the issue that Lynn raised in terms of what we can do here, how we can use this for management. And in the review, it was mentioned that there are 5 stocks where there's sustainable adult mortality, one of which was the Hudson River. But then the Hudson River is also listed as depleted. And one of the comments was that it was depleted due to recruitment failure. So 2-part question, I guess. One is, do we know what's driving that recruitment failure in the Hudson River? And then the second part is there really any stock recruitment relationship for shad in general or in the Hudson River specifically?
Mike, you want to take a shot at that?
I think it's that river is in Karn's backyard. I may bump it off to Karn or Jeff to answer those.
All right.
Yeah, this is Fishery Science 101, I guess. It's I'm on the spotlight or on the hot seat. I wish that Wes Eakin could chime in, but I see it as a couple things. One is the possibility that the stocks being so low as they are right now are being affected by that commercial fishery in the Delaware. That's one issue. So that's not really recruitment, that's the adults, but they're not being caught in the Hudson because the fishery in the Hudson's closed. But fish don't respect our boundaries, of course. The other worry that I have is the juvenile mortality from predation, by and large. That's just not very well assessed. And I think the managers know it. It's just a question of how many hours in the day are there. And this would be a great thing, again, to sponsor some students to study and get more of a handle on it. Students are relatively inexpensive compared to staff. So that's one issue. And then I think the third is the threat of climate change and increased storms. So that's maybe a little bit more long term, but I have a PhD student now, Chris Knack, who suddenly realized when he did his master's and then was going on for his PhD, he was collecting data for the PhD during double back-to-back hurricanes, Hurricane Irene and Tropical Storm Lee that were 3 weeks apart. And they basically, although they weren't affecting spawning shad because it was in late fall, it ripped up the habitat so badly that there was essentially a recruitment failure the following year. So, as that sort of, as those phenomena happen, again, it gets back to how do you make those, when we think about things like habitat restoration, how do you make habitat not only great places for the fish for young fish to grow or fish to spawn and then the nursery habitats, but also how do you make them resilient? And so it's not just, shoreline resilience for people, it's also habitat resilience for the organisms that live in those ecosystems. So getting back to your question about sustainable mortality, my comment was, again, I just think it's bumping along at very low levels right now.
And this is Jeff. If I could just jump in and add a comment. I think that the Hudson is a prime example of the caveat we've included in this assessment, which is we don't know juvenile mortality levels. The mortality estimates that we've put forward in this assessment are solely from the adult fish that return as spawners and the decline in that age structure when they return to the river as spawners. And so there's this big gap between when these fish are young of year in the river, and we do have actually some young of year surveys, and then when they leave and go out to the ocean and stay in the ocean, aside that some that might return, as Dr. Lindberg noted, we just don't know what the mortality levels are. So there could certainly still be factors that are leading to unsustainable juvenile mortality. And so even when they do return as adults and experience sustainable mortality, they've already been impacted to a degree to where they're not going to trend towards a rebuilding stock because of that high juvenile mortality.
So then relative to part B of my question then, Jeff, based on what you just said, am I to assume then that there really is no stock recruit relationship with shad?
It may just be that there's an additional factor that we don't know of that contributes to that stock recruit relationship. And so, you know, the young of year may actually be tied to the adults. Yeah, I'm not sure if it's just something that impacts those young of year and that is suppressing them from increasing in their relative abundance. But yeah, I'm not sure I have a better answer for you.
It's, Emerson, I think that there's probably not enough contrast in the data now to see that because the populations are so depressed. I mean, at least in the Hudson. If you wanted to establish a stock recruitment relationship, you might be able to do it in the Columbia River, which has the world's largest population of American shad. There are over 7 million there. It's a wonderful system, but it's not here. And they don't like shad out there.
All right, thank you. So we're way behind now. If we can get questions more towards whether we accept this as a package or not, the review and the assessment, and in the coming meetings when we're talking about actions and should we do it, I think we can get into the meat of it more. I mean, these questions are important and they're really good questions, but we're going to have to cut off questions in a little bit, and there are a couple of public comments we want to do. But back to the board, and so we're discussing whether we should accept this. Tony, do we have more comments?
We do not have any more questions from the board. We have 3 questions from the public that I'm aware of.
Okay, and we'll do that by hand raising. Yep. Yes.
First one is George Jackson.
Go ahead, George.
George, you have to unmute yourself by pushing that microphone button. It should turn green.
Yes. Hello, Dr. Lindberg.
Hello.
Great presentation. You had mentioned the shad line in Delaware Bay, and I wanted to cite the Waldman et al. 2014 paper. We know a mixed stock fishery exists in Delaware Bay, and we know the Hudson River shad are depleted. Why isn't the line moved north to protect those shad of a mixed stock origin or those with a Hudson River provenance? And then one more question, if I may ask. With regard to the habitat model, looking at dams, the Hudson River didn't show so much impact from dams, but there was a 60% loss of habitat, shad spawning habitat to accommodate navigation. How is that accounted for?
Mike, you want to try those? You know, the first question was a management decision. Do you want to comment on that, Mike?
The first one I will not comment on. I think there's other folks who could speak better to that. To the second question about the habitat model, the habitat model was based very much on dams and accessibility. In the write-up, we did include some discussion about, we're not talking about water quality. We know there's been a lot of changes to habitat. There's been a lot of changes to submerged aquatic vegetation. Those weren't covered in this kind of big 40,000 foot view model. We do realize some river systems have habitat degradation that is not dam related, and that was, we weren't able to get at that at a coastwide level, so we didn't get to it, and in the write-up it should reflect that. But for the first question, I'm not familiar enough with it, and I know there were decisions made that I had no part of, so I don't. Maybe someone else can answer that better.
Well, I think, George, I don't think the person is sitting on a mic right now who can answer that. But it's clearly, there's been a lot of work since that line's been set in Delaware Bay. And this may very well be part of an action that we can move forward over the next board meeting or two under the recommendation of the technical committee, which we'll be discussing in a few minutes. So I'll leave it at that. Thank you.
Thank you.
Next, public, Tony.
Sorry, I was on mute. We have Jim Cummings.
Go ahead, Jim.
Yeah, thank you very much. Thank you, Chairman, for letting me speak. And I want to also extend my thanks to the committee and the peer review team for an excellent job. I was involved in the 2000 assessment. I know it's a lot of work, and I really appreciate what they've done. A little background for the board members. I'm a retired biologist since 2016, but I had a 31-year career focused on fisheries management. I started the DC Fisheries program in 1985 with Jack Buckley, probably the only living person that started such a jurisdictional program. And then from 1988 to 2016, I worked for the Interstate Commission on the Potomac, including working on shad restoration in the Potomac. And I've done that since 95 onward. And I remember when the Potomac was really in bad shape, we were told we weren't even going to find enough shad to stock Potomac origin fry upstream of a modified dam. We couldn't beg, borrow, or steal any eggs from anybody else. So we went out on the river. I got a Virginia waterman to help me out, and we successfully had a restoration from 1995 to 2002. And then the Potomac became the river of broodstock for the Susquehanna, for Maryland rivers, and for the Rappahannock River. So I've seen the river change from nothing to really good, and I have to disagree a little bit with the conclusions on page 227 that the Potomac stock is currently experiencing unsustainable mortality. I really agree that there's been somewhat of an abundance plateau in the population over the last 4 or 5 years, but the longer term trend over the last 25 years has been strongly upwards. And I support the peer review panel's recommendation that the data quality issues are such a concern that the output for the current model should not be used to provide estimates for management purposes. One other factor to consider is that is the ocean predation and bycatch mortality. Again, with the Potomac is a good example. It's pretty much an undammed river now. It's got good habitat. It should be really increasing a lot, but we've reached a plateau, and I think a lot of that is due more to what's going on in the ocean with predation. When there are few rivers coastwide, sadly, that are doing as well as the Potomac. So when the Potomac population is out in the ocean, they're being heavily preyed upon, and probably in the bycatch, there's a disproportionate number of Potomac shad that are taken in the bycatch fisheries too. So for over 15 years of my annual reports on the shad project, I noted that you know, if in order for the Potomac or any shad population to do well, it's really reliant on the whole population of shad up and down the coast doing well, because we're at such low numbers. They're being heavily preyed on. And the importance of shad in restoring other fish should also be mentioned. I mean, at one time when the shad were real abundant and other fisheries were doing well, you know, we don't have that anymore. It's really impacting other fisheries. And Spencer Baird mentioned in 1877 a report that the demise they were seeing of the cod was linked to the lower numbers of shad and herring that were because of the damming of the rivers at that time. So it's important to keep that in mind too. But I do think this new the Potomac model and these advancements are really great. I like the report in general. And I would mention that I think it's actually time to open up the recreational fishery in the Potomac, which has been closed since 1983. With the recreational fisheries closure, the attention and care for the fish really went south. Not only did the shad become very rare, it became a forgotten fish. And I'm an advocate for a very light reopening of the recreational fishing, which is primarily in the District of Columbia, and letting a few fish be taken by those anglers to keep up the concern for the fish. And that's about what I have to say. The blue catfish, there's a little bit of, I've long worried about that because I was witnessing the Maryland coming out and collecting, Maryland, Virginia folks coming out and collecting the blue catfish in the spring for their stomach content analysis, while we had 4 different agencies out collecting shad for broodstock. At the end of the evening, since there wasn't anything we could do with those squished up fish, we cut them up and threw them overboard. So some of the data on the blue catfish consumption of shad, even though it's light, it might have been part of it could have been due to the availability of freshly killed shad. And I would mention to Marty that one of the potential management measures we could take is we currently have a 10% replacement stocking on all these programs that are taking fish out of the Potomac for stocking in other rivers, and we could increase that percentage to 15 or 25% as a measure to help reduce the impact on the Potomac fishery. And with that, I'm finished. Again, I think the Potomac population is recovering, but I thank you for this assessment and for ongoing and future American shad restoration efforts, which are sorely needed. So thank you.
Thank you, Jim. Any more public questions, Tony?
We have one last question from the public, Des Khan.
Des.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Can you hear me?
I can.
Very good. I appreciate the chance to pop this question. I'm going to start with a question, and then I'm going to give the rationale. The question is, when, if ever, will the commission conduct a serious investigation of the predation impact of our unprecedented abundance of striped bass on other fisheries, including primarily, but not exclusively, shad and river herring? When will that happen? The commission has studiously ignored this question. And as an example, in the 2007 American Shad Assessment, 2 of the premier, actually the top experts in the world on American shad, which was Dr. Victor Krecko and Tom Savoy of the Connecticut DEP, who published more peer-reviewed papers combined than anyone by far on American shad, submitted their report on the Connecticut River and documented extensively how the formerly booming American shad and blueback herring run up the Connecticut River virtually declined and almost disappeared, at least in the case of herring, as striped bass rebounded in the 1990s into the 2000s. They submitted this report as part of the Connecticut report. It was suppressed under the former director. It was suppressed. It was retained only as a minority report in the 2007 stock assessment. They have also published a peer-reviewed paper to this effect. I believe it was in the Connecticut River volume. Now, the subsequent, I believe, to that assessment, Connecticut hired a team from the University of Connecticut to do a diet study on striped bass in the Connecticut River. And Justin Davis, who spoke earlier, was the primary person, along with Eric Schultz. They documented by stomach contents that the largest 10% of striped bass in the Connecticut River were eating adult shad in the spring. The other 90% were eating herring, primarily blueback herring. Now, this does not talk about striped bass predation on juvenile shad. This was just on adults. And so after that, I was working in 2011 on the stock assessment of the Delaware River. I took Roy's former place on the Delaware River Fish and Wildlife Co-op committee. And we were doing the assessment. I figured since they saw this in the Connecticut, I'd look at the Delaware. I plotted the abundance indices of American shad in the river and striped bass in the Delaware, waters of Delaware. My jaw hit the floor. There was a unbelievable negative correlation between the two. In the 80s, when bass were in the tank, American shad in the Delaware River were booming. Up in Pennsylvania, New Jersey, there's a recreational fishery that was very strong. Hundreds of thousands of pounds of American shad were being landed by commercial fishers in Delaware Bay at the same time. And yet, when striped bass increased in the 90s, that run declined. When bass peaked in the 2000s, American shad were so low that managers were alarmed. Since then, when bass have declined some, the index of shad is going up. This chart is in a essay I submitted to the striped bass board.
Hey, Des, are you near the end? I'm going to have to stop you. You started with a question, which was, I imagine, is rhetorical.
No, the question was,
well,
I'll investigate.
Go ahead.
That's all. That's my question. When is the
okay? I don't, as you well know, there isn't an answer. We don't know that, but we've heard from both Karen and Mike time and time again what can be put in as environmental effects, and they talk about it. So your point is not lost at all. I don't think this is the time we don't have time to talk about it, but I appreciate you raising it, and it's absolutely an important point. So thank you, Des. Tony, are we done with the public?
We have one member of the public that had not asked a question yet, and now he's taken his hand down. So
okay.
There it is. His hand is back up. So Seth, this would be the last question from the public.
Okay, Seth.
Agama. And
yeah, go ahead, Seth.
Seth, you should be able to use your microphone. There you go.
Seth,
thank you very much.
I know this is probably about the Potomac. If it's redundant to what Jim's very eloquent talk, could you keep it maybe very short, because we're really behind at this point.
Yes, Mr. Chairman. Thank you for your time. I wanted to thank the staff for tremendous and impressive work. I particularly appreciate highlighting the Jeff Kipp's work on the Potomac model and highlighting the impact of the broodstock removals. It seems to me that advocates and anglers like myself have some work to do with our representatives on the council in that regard, and making sure that those removal programs are the high quality programs that they should be, given that they're accounting for mortality. I do support a limited recreational harvest of American shad. We have work to do until DC and the PRFC come to you with that proposal. Until then, thank you very much for the assessment. I did promise to be brief, but Thoreau wrote in 1845 of the effect of dams on anadromous fish. who hears the fishes when they cry? So thank you for hearing.
Thank you. Going back to the board, so we're now considering acceptance of the assessment and the review, and we sort of meshed the comments have been into that. So we can take some more comments on the relative merits of accepting it or not, but I'd like to get a motion, if I could, to accept the assessment and the peer review for management use. Would someone like to make that motion?
You have Pat Kelleher.
Pat, are you making that motion?
I'd be happy to, Mr. Chairman. I would move that we accept the benchmark stock assessment and peer review for management use.
Thank you. Do we have a second?
You do. Cherie Patterson.
Cherie Patterson, seconds. Excellent. Pat and Cherie, I'm guessing you don't need to justify why you did that. So any discussion on this? Any hands, Tony?
Just, no hands.
No hands. So it would always be easier in this format to do it by consensus. So is there anyone who would vote against this? And do we need to caucus? Any hands, Tony?
No hands.
All right, seeing none, I am going to declare this motion accepted by consensus. All right, excellent, and thank you all involved, the review committee and the assessment committee. Awesome work. We've got a lot of work to digest this and move on with responses to it, which is the next agenda item. Clearly, in my mind, we don't have enough information nor enough time to craft specific responses by this board to what's in that. So what I'd like to do is consider charging the technical committee with coming up a suite of responses, and these could be for individual stocks that are not sustainable or depleted, or coast-wide actions also that could relate to improving data collection, et cetera, et cetera. Caitlin, could you help me out here? Is that appropriate to charge the technical committee coming up with responses?
Mike, I just wanted to let
you hear me? Oh,
yes.
All right, go ahead, Tony.
know that Pat Kelleher has his hand up.
Pat, you would like to weigh in?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I agree. It's really tough at this late hour in the meeting to get into a lot of details, but I do think it would be appropriate to task the TC and the PDT with identifying potential paths forward. And if it pleases the chairman, I'd be happy to make that motion.
It pleases me immensely.
So with that, Mr. Chairman, I would move to task the TC and the PDT with identifying for the board potential paths forward to improve shad stocks given the results of the stock assessment.
And I believe Emerson Hasbrook is seconding that motion.
All right.
Yes, I'll second it.
Okay. Do we? I guess we'll wait till we get that up.
Repeat the motion, please.
Sure. Task the TC and the PDT with identifying for the board potential paths forward to improve shad stocks given the results of the stock assessment.
And who was the second?
Emerson, I believe. If not, he is now.
Yes.
Thank you. Would either of you like to comment?
Yeah, Mr. Chairman, this is Pat Kelleher. I think it's clear from the stock assessment there are a lot of areas of concerns as it pertains to this species. I certainly appreciated the fact that there is an emphasis on habitat and the need to access habitat. That certainly has been our focus here in the state of Maine, and we're seeing the benefits of that work. So I think it's time to kind of roll our sleeves up when it comes to the species and really start to look at what we can do to make some additional changes going forward. So thank you.
Thank you.
Mike, you have Emerson and then Roy Miller.
Okay, Emerson.
I thought my hand was down, so my hand was up just to, for the second the motion. I don't have anything to add beyond what Pat has already mentioned.
All right, thank you. Roy Miller.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. For the makers and seconder of the motion, I just wanted to clarify that advice to the TC and PDT, is that with the assumption that they'll be making river-specific recommendations for paths forward rather than a generic list of things that can be done? Because the river-specific recommendations would be much more helpful, and that's sort of obvious, but I wanted to make sure that that was the intent of the maker of the motion.
I would think it is, but do you want to refine it to reflect that?
That certainly was my intent, Mr. Chairman, but I didn't go into that level of specificity in case there are some other areas within management that need to be looked at kind of from a regional aspect as well. So I left it a little bit broad to give them some flexibility.
Sure. And
I completely agree, though, with Roy's thinking around river specific. If we're not really having some detailed, focused efforts on a river by river basis, we're never going to get to the point we need to with the species.
Right, but there also may be some coastwide things, like everyone needs to move to otoliths and things like that we need to capture also. So, Tony, do you think this is specific enough, Tony and/or Mike Bailey? Or Caitlin?
Yeah, this is Caitlin. I think that this is clear enough that the technical committee, so we normally don't have a PDT unless an action is initiated. So I guess we could start with the technical committee developing some recommendations, and depending on those recommendations, move forward with a PDT looking at them. Does that sound appropriate?
Okay. So we'd have to meet again before we task it PDT. Is that correct?
Correct.
So
it would be TC and or the SAS that you would identify potential paths forwards, but usually just the TC.
So would Pat perfect got rid of
You broke up a little bit there, Mike.
I said, would it be better if Pat perfects this motion and gets rid of the PDT in it?
Sure.
Okay.
I delete and PDT. Thank you.
So the motion is move to task the TC with identifying for the board potential paths forward to improve shad stocks given the results of the stock assessment. And I've heard that is sufficient to cover Roy's concerns and maybe some of my concerns, broad-based things we need to consider. Comments on the motion?
You have Lynn Fagley.
Lynn, go ahead.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I just wanted to clarify that this is different from the research recommendations that are, thoroughly listed in the assessment reports. And I don't know if it needs to be specified in the motion, but I'm assuming this is really paths forward in terms of, functional management items rather than things that could be done to improve our state of knowledge, which would allow us to, which is a path forward for improving the stock. So I just want to make sure we're delineating kind of for the technical committee sort of research, study work that needs to be done from a management path forward.
It's more complicated than it sounds. I think the former, we're looking for management actions that need to be done. But I think if the TC identifies a research need, like all states move to using otoliths for aging, then that could be put into an addendum or some sort of action. That's as we see fit. But I think it's geared, and Pat can correct me, I think it's geared towards management actions that we can take to address the issues in the assessment. Does that answer your question, Lynn?
Yes, it does. Thank you.
Okay. Any other hands, Tony?
Those were all your hands from the board. There is one member of the public that has had their hand up.
Okay, I'm not going to take any public comment at this point. So I think we're going to move to see if this is by consensus we can approve this. Is anyone opposed to this motion?
I do not see any hands.
Seeing none, this motion passes by consensus. Thank you. All right, at this point, well, we're scheduled for a break, and can we take a 5-minute, literally just 5 minutes for biological break? And we'll start again at 11:15.
Sounds good, Mike.
Okay.
Roy Miller, are you at your computer still?
Yes, ma'am.
Could you do me a favor and either, I guess, email me John Clark's cell phone number? I know he got his power went out and he's having
His
trouble.
power did run out, and he is, when I just talked to him a few minutes ago, he was going to drive to the Dover office to see if they still have power.
Okay.
They had a lot of damage in John's neighborhood.
Okay, because I was going to try to talk him through using the phone, but I don't have a cell phone number to call him. So I was trying to out. I don't want you to give it over the
Tony, I think I have his cell phone number.
Okay, Tina.
I'll send it to you.
Okay, and I guess, Roy, what I'll do is I'll wait if he comes on via the office, and then if not, I'll give him a call during lunch.
Okay.
I don't want to bug him while he's driving.
All right, so I don't need to do anything at this moment?
Nope,
we're good.
Okay.
Thank you.
Maya, if you're there, do you care if I take over the presenter mode now?
That's fine. Allison, I know you were disconnected, so I have opened your line back up so you can talk whenever you need to now.
Thank you.
Yep. Adam, I just got your message. Thank you. Tina, if you have a cell phone number for Tom Fody, you could text that to me at the same time.
I don't think so, but let me check.
Okay. He has lost his power as well.
I'm checking MMS.
Bob, I have unmuted you.
Yeah.
But you open up. Oh, yeah. Never mind. Never mind. I will not unmute you.
Tony, can you hear me? This is Ken.
I can, Ken.
Okay.
And Roy Miller, you are still, your microphone is still open, just so you know. There you go. And Ken, just so you know, your mic is live right now.
Yeah, I can turn it off. Yep.
Okay, I just wanted to make sure you knew. That was all.
Tony, I just texted Laura and I'll get it to you.
Thanks. And Tina, I guess the other thing that I'm going to need is that open line phone number so I can give it to them. Or can they, because they can't connect with the computer phone, only audio if they don't have computers.
I will text it.
Thanks.
How's the storm down there, by the way?
Here in DC, it seems to have lightened up. I'm sure that it's moving up the coast now that some of these other folks are losing power.
Actually, Tony, the information is in the chat box with the phone number.
Tina. Thank you.
Do you see that?
I do see it, but it's the audio only. I need audio with speaking ability.
I believe it's the 415-655-0060 is the phone number that they can call in.
Okay, got it. I see what you're saying. Yep. Thanks.
The problem is I need to give them an access code.
Yeah.
So we have to choose that we need to make them panelists. You okay with that?
Yep, that's fine.
I'll send you that code.
Thanks.
Tony, are we ready to resume?
Sure are. Thanks, Mike.
All right. Looking at the radar image, I see New Jersey and Delaware. You are in the belly of the beast right now. I think we've lost a few people off the line. So the next is the technical committee review of the state proposals to resolve inconsistencies with Amendment 2 and 3, and that'll be presented by Ken Sprankle, who's the TC chair. Go ahead, Ken.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Chairman. Good morning, everyone. This presentation this morning will be shared by Caitlin and myself. I'm going to start by covering the board charges, the TC's work and approach on those, and the TC's recommendations. And Caitlin will cover later on how the TC recommendations relate to the existing FMPs for both shad and river herring to help with any discussion. Could I have the next slide, please? Our presentation is going to start with some background information, the TC's recommendations. Those had been presented originally back at the October 2019 board meeting. We'll follow that by the TC review of the state proposals that were directed for development by the board. And those are going to include plans for Maine, New Hampshire, the Delaware River Basin Cooperative, state of Delaware, North Carolina, South Carolina, Georgia, and Florida. So we got a lot to cover. We'll cover them quickly, but hopefully thoroughly. The board can then decide on actions, and we'll end with remaining tasks for the TC. Both amendments, I'm just going to remind folks that, as many are aware, that both amendments 2 and 3 require all states and jurisdictions to submit sustainable fish management plans for all systems that remain open to river herring and shad harvest, either rec or commercial, and that catch and release fishing can be permitted on any river without an SFMP. In the plans, in the amendments, they state that specifically the SFMPs must demonstrate fisheries are sustainable with quantifiable sustainability metrics and annual monitoring. And sustainability is defined as will not diminish future stock reproduction and recruitment. I want to also note that both amendments also describe an alternative management regime option that may be proposed for board approval. And that's further defined as if the proposal has the same conservation values as the measures contained within the amendment. Next slide, please. In October 2017, the TC identified inconsistencies between state management programs and FMP requirements for both Amendment 2 and 3. The board then tasked the TC to develop recommendations to address them. And some examples of these inconsistencies included tributaries of river systems that have SFMPs and monitoring, but where tributaries are not explicitly addressed. Second, rivers open to harvest in an SFMP, but with no monitoring to address sustainability. And lastly, for a third one, rivers open to harvest without an SFMP and or monitoring, but where little to no harvest is suspected. Again, in October 2019, the TC presented a report on these inconsistencies and recommendations for resolving each issue. And at that board meeting, the TC was requested to have the state submit proposals to resolve inconsistencies consistent with the TC recommendations. Next slide, please. The TC's recommendations for these inconsistencies included 3 options. The first one I have shown here is catch and release only regulations. Those are for systems with no plans that appeared to have the most clear-cut option, and it was also sustainable, of course. Catch and release regulations have been implemented by most states without SFMP metrics. Another option was the application of sustainability metrics for monitored systems, and that's where sustainability metrics can be applied to a broader geographic area for unmonitored areas. And the amendments speak to the fact that statewide metrics may be used. And lastly, we have the alternative management regimes that I mentioned. The TC considered this option may be appropriate for systems with no known harvest. Next slide, please. So I'm going to review now some of the summarized elements of the proposed individual state plans. Next slide. The state of Maine has an existing approved river herring SFMP. The issue was a statewide 25 fish recreational bag limit with limited monitoring. And the state proposal includes updating the SFMP to manage all rivers in a region based on fishway counts as a sustainability metric from 5 fishways across the state. And those fishways include These are all first on the Saco River, Androscoggin, Kennebec, Penobscot, and St. Croix. And for folks not familiar with Maine, that is spanning sort of south to north in a northward direction across their coastal river systems. The 25th percentile of the fishway count mean will be used for each fishway as a management benchmark trigger. And that's for each fishway, with management actions applied on a regional basis, just based upon the geographic area located between neighboring monitored areas, if the metric falls under the 25th percentile for 3 consecutive years. The mean annual count of all fishways will also be used with the 25th percentile benchmark trigger, and that's also a 3-year consecutive basis. If that was tripped, that would cause a statewide management action. And the TC's recommendation is support approval of this SFMP update. Next slide, please. The state of Maine currently has no approved SFMP for American shad. The issue is a statewide 2-fish recreational bag limit. The state's proposed a new American shad SFMP that will use a statewide applied sustainability metrics based on annual fishway counts from 5 fishways, and also a JAI value for the Merry Meeting Bay. And Merry Meeting Bay covers Kennebec and Androscoggin. That's two of the 2 major river systems flow into it. The 5 fishways that are used, also going from south to north, will be the Saco, Androscoggin, Kennebec, Sebasticook, and the Penobscot rivers. Again, the 25th percentile value from the data time series is going to serve as the trigger for the JAI and also for the individual fishway annual passage counts. 3 consecutive years below the 25th percentile will trigger a management response. Because they have both fishway counts and the JAI, if only one of the data types, either JAI or one or more of the fish counts, meets a trigger, the rec limit would be reduced to 1 fish. If both the JAI and one or more fishways are below the trigger for 3 consecutive years, then the action would be to move to catch and release only. And the technical committee recommendation is support of approval of the new SFMP. Next slide, please. The state of New Hampshire has an approved river herring SFMP. The issue was a lack of monitoring on the Salmon Falls River. That's a shared water body with the state of Maine. The state's proposed to update the SFMP with language that identifies the Salmon Falls River as included in the existing Great Bay sustainability metric, with the same subsequent management actions applied based on triggers. We're going to talk about those in a moment. The TC recommendation is support of approval of the updated SFMP. Next slide. We also learned back in the early spring, the state of New Hampshire had a concern with compliance. It's based on their defined management action from a triggered sustainability metric. The management threshold for their river herring SFMP is 75,450 river herring passed among their Great Bay monitored fishways, and that was not reached in 2019, which should trigger a closure for 2020. Back in the spring, the state provided the board with a letter and also discussed with the TC the issues surrounding that reaching that trigger. So Cherie Patterson again submitted a letter. It's dated April 7th about how they fell under the 3-year running average that would trigger the benchmark management action and the issues associated with that. And as I said, Mike Dione, he's the TC member from New Hampshire. He met with the TC and we discussed it. There are a number of several different causes for that, included some concerns with the multi-tube fish counter, low water temperatures, and dam removal and habitat use occurring downstream of one of the fishways. Next slide. Thanks. The New Hampshire River Herring Plan states that if the 3-year running average benchmark of the Great Bay fishways fall below the threshold, they institute a fishery closure. So In April, that letter again requested the fishery remain open in 2020, given their explanation of the issues and plans to take steps to address them. And the TC recommendation based upon that original letter was to support the approach of requesting board exemption from their SFMP benchmark trigger, given the variables impacting the counts in 2019 for the 2020 season. Now, Caitlin and I also communicated with New Hampshire Fish and Game for an update. Cherie Patterson has recently submitted a letter to the board. That letter is dated 7/30, has not been reviewed by the TC. The recent letter to the board restates the request for the 2020 fishery to be open with a planned closure for the fishery in 2021 due to the second year of being below the threshold trigger based upon 2020 run count data. Next slide, please. The Delaware River Cooperative has an approved Shad SFMP. The issue was tributaries that were not identified in the plan. The co-op plan's been revised to identify tidal reaches of rivers in both New Jersey and Delaware, and the technical committee recommendation is to support the proposed revision to clarify system tributaries in the plan. Next slide, please. The state of Delaware does not have a state-specific SFMP plan for shad. They also had an issue with allowing recreational harvest in tributaries to the Chesapeake Bay. The Delaware proposal is to implement catch and release regulations for all Chesapeake Bay tributaries, which is expected to be processed by end of this calendar year. And the TC recommendation is support approval with the regulatory changes consistent with Amendment 3. Next slide, please. The state of North Carolina has an approved Shad SFMP. The issues were tributaries that are not included in the plan, and also no monitoring and no SFMP for the Little River, which is a shared water body with the state of South Carolina. The states revised their SFMP to identify and incorporate tributaries in the SFMP and also include the Little River, stating that system will be managed consistent with the South Carolina SFMP that includes that system in the Winyah Bay for its sustainability metrics and management actions. The TC recommendation is to support approval of the proposed SFMP update. Next slide, please. The state of South Carolina has an approved river herring sustainable fish management plan. The issues for the river herring include tributaries of open systems not identified in the SFMP and recreational harvest that is open in systems without an SFMP. And that includes the Little River, Wando, Ashley, the Ace Basin, Coosawhatchie, and the Savannah River. The state proposal is to update the SFMP to include the tributaries of monitored systems, and those include updates to all the tributaries of the Winyah Bay and the Santee Cooper system are identified. And the Little River will utilize the PD metric and management response. In addition, the state proposes to use an alternative management plan for unmonitored systems that are open to recreational harvest. Those systems include the Wando, Ashley, Ace Basin, Coosawhatchie, and Savannah River. And I'm just going to note here that we have 3 South Carolina plans to summarize here. So the TC recommendations are going to follow after we cover all of these. Next slide, please. The South Carolina Alternative Management Plan includes the Ace Basin, the Coosawhatchie, and Savannah Rivers. The plan describes that South Carolina is unaware of any rec fishing for river herring in these systems. That includes using MRIP data. Commercial fishing is not allowed in any of those waters. Their plan describes river herring as functionally absent in these areas and provides data from fishery independent surveys that include 2 Shad Young of the Year electrofishing surveys that are annually conducted in both the Edisto and Savannah rivers. The plan notes that a total of 28 juvenile blueback herring have been collected over 10 years of these surveys. The plan also notes that Georgia DNR has a 10-year spring adult shad electrofishing survey that's conducted below the first barrier on the Savannah River that also supports their position. Their plan includes changes to regulations or development of an SFMP if any survey detects a positive recreational harvest for 3 consecutive years. Positive was defined as the most conservative. It would just be a single observation would count. They also note the fishery independent and fishery dependent surveys are also planned to continue, and that annual survey results are to be reported in the annual compliance report. Next slide, please. Lastly, the state of South Carolina has an approved Shad SFMP. The issue is that tributaries of monitored systems that are not included in the SFMP. The state proposes to link tributaries to monitored systems with sustainability metrics, and the system definitions are consistent with those in the river herring SFMP. Next slide. So the TC recommends supporting approval of all 3 South Carolina proposals: the river herring SFMP update, the river herring alternative management plan, and I'll remind you again that that includes the TC requests that all available monitoring data mentioned in the plan are to be submitted annually with the compliance reports. And then lastly, recommends approval of the Shad SFMP update as well. Next slide, please. The state of Georgia has an approved Shad SFMP. The issues are unmonitored river systems in the plan and the sustainability metric for the Savannah River, which is no longer considered viable by Georgia. The Georgia SFMP proposal updates the tributaries that are covered by systems, and also applies the Ultima metric and benchmark to other systems with insufficient data, specifically the St. Mary's and Satilla rivers. Only the Altamaha and Savannah River allow both recreational and commercial fisheries. The other systems are recreational only. The Savannah River has had its commercial shad fishery decline consistently to the point where the use of commercial netter sustainability metric is unreliable. And so the Georgia proposal is to use an ongoing 10-year fishery independent spring electrofishing survey for adult shad that's conducted below the Army Corps Bluff Lock and Dam facility. And Georgia proposes to use the annual CPUE data relative to a 25th percentile value for the data time series as benchmark trigger. And that would trigger management action if below for 3 consecutive years. The Ultima sustainability measure is a Georgia fishery independent gillnet CPUE with a benchmark trigger of 3 consecutive years falling below the 25th percentile. And the TC recommendation is to support approval. Next slide, please. The state of Georgia has no SFMP for river herring. Commercial fishing for river herring is not allowed, but recreational fishing is unregulated. The state's proposed an alternative management plan for systems statewide that would maintain no commercial fishing and for recreational fisheries to remain unregulated. State plan notes that there are no landings records for river herring, and there's no known directed recreational effort for river herring. The plan describes river herring as functionally absent from systems and provides data available from both fishery independent and fishery dependent surveys. In Amendment 2, under monitoring table requirements, Table 15 and 16, it states there are currently no known river herring populations in Georgia. Should populations be established, the Management Board has the authority to require a fisheries independent monitoring program be implemented. That was from one of the tables. The other one, of course, would speak to fishery dependent monitoring. Some examples of some of the data that were cited include DNR annual creel surveys in the Altamaha, and that's a survey that's conducted from April through November. That's shown no records for river herring harvest. On the Ogeechee, a creel survey is conducted every 5 years, and that occurs from February to June. Also, no records shown there. They've also looked at MRIP data that shows no harvest records as well. In terms of fishery independent data, that includes the Savannah River Adult Spring Shad Electrofishing Survey I just mentioned. That survey has produced a total of 3 reported river herring over the data time series. The plan also cites a spring electrofishing survey on the Ogeechee for adult shad that has not observed any river herring. Other rivers in the state have rotational electrofishing surveys that have not observed any river herring. They have juvenile index vein surveys for shad that are also conducted from July through September in the Ogeechee, Altamaha, and Savannah River, and they've had limited river herring captures. Since 2011, a total of 13,300 juvenile shad have been collected in those surveys, with a total of 267 blueback herring captured in those surveys as well. Next page, next slide, please. The proposal notes Georgia will continue with the described fishery independent and fishery dependent surveys, and they'll provide data from monitoring in their annual compliance reports. If they detect any positive recreational harvest in any survey in any single year, they will investigate to see if additional data collection is warranted. If a positive harvest is detected for 3 consecutive years, Georgia will take steps to ensure sustainability for that river system. They note in the plan that no fishery independent data will be used at this time as part of their plan. And the TC recommendation is support approval with annual monitoring data provided in compliance reports. Next slide, please. The state of Florida has a Shad SFMP. The issue included the tributaries of the St. Johns River were not identified. The St. Johns is the only system identified in the SFMP, although there are statewide ALOSA recreational harvest regulations. The state proposed to update the Shad SFMP and include the tributaries of the St. Johns, and a TC recommendation is support approval of this update. Next slide, please. Florida proposes an alternative management plan to address the potential recreational harvest of river herring statewide and shad outside of the St. Johns River. The issue is again the statewide 10 fish rec limit on ALOSA species with no SFMP for river herring or shad outside of the St. Johns River. The proposal is an alternative management plan that will maintain existing regulations. The plan reviews a lack of any credible data or reports for any river herring or shad harvest outside of the St. Johns River. There are also no fishery independent data to support river herring or shad occurrence outside of the St. Johns River Basin. Next slide, please. The alternative management plan will continue to examine and monitor both shad and river herring, both fishery independent and fishery dependent surveys in the St. Johns. And Florida will coordinate with Georgia for any survey data for the St. Mary's River, the shared water body. Florida will also monitor MRIP data for both species. If any positive harvest detection occurs for 3 consecutive years, Florida will initiate a process to demonstrate sustainability for that system. If it cannot, regulatory changes will be enacted. And the TC recommendation is support approval. And as with the other alternative management plans, any monitoring data for these species in any system will be provided annually in their compliance reports. And with that, I'm going to let Caitlin take over, and she will cover these remaining slides.
All right, thanks, Ken. So I switched the order of the slides a little bit from the overview, so sorry if that was confusing. But before we get into what the board actions are to be considered today, I did want to go over what the TC is up to in terms of developing recommendations for the remaining items from the original board task related to improving amendments 2 and 3 in the 5 areas that are listed on this slide. So the current plan is that the technical committee has formed a subgroup, which is a smaller task group that's focusing on developing draft recommendations, and they are continuing to meet and will present those draft recommendations to the full TC, and then the TC will finalize recommendations to be presented to the board at a future meeting. And you'll note here that the de minimis issue is crossed off because it's already been resolved. That was presented at the last meeting. So those remaining 4 items are what the TC will be developing recommendations are in terms of potential modifications to the FMP to help with some of these issues. So in terms of the board actions for consideration related to this agenda item, today the board may consider approval of the state proposals that were presented, and secondly, consider approval of the request from New Hampshire for an exemption to their SFMP requirement to close their river herring fishery in 2020, despite having fallen below that sustainability threshold, which again, they assert is due to technical issues with their fish counts and other explanatory variables rather than true fish passage concerns. And to help with the first board action related to approving the state proposals, this table is summarizing all of the proposals that were submitted from each state that we've gone over today. And I highlighted in bold the proposals for the alternative management plans from South Carolina, Georgia, and Florida, just because I think the board may want to have a kind of separate or focused discussion on these since they're a bit different from what we are used to with the SFMPs. And then this is my last slide before questions and board discussions, but I did think it would be helpful to give a reminder of what Amendment 2 provides in terms of guidance on the alternative management regimes or alternative management plans. So Amendment 2 says that these plans must demonstrate that the proposed management program will not contribute to overfishing of the resource or inhibit restoration of the resource, and that they must show to the board's satisfaction that the alternative proposal will have the same conservation value as the measures in Amendment 2. And that to me seems to reference the requirement to implement catch and release only regulations in the absence of a sustainable fishery management plan. So when the board is considering the 3 alternative plans today, I think an important question to keep in mind is, does the plan meet these 2 criteria or not? So that's the end of our presentation, and Ken and I can take any questions.
Any questions from the board, Tony?
None that I see yet.
And just to, so based on Caitlin's advice, I think we probably have 3 motions we'd like to make just so we can have a little bit of discussion on each. And one is a motion to accept the sustainable fishery management plans and any amendments they made. One motion to approve the alternative management plans, and then consider the request by New Hampshire separately, of which I think Cherie has a motion. So any broad questions or like, I don't think at this point any state has to defend what they've put out unless they're attacked, of course, which you know may happen. So Tony, seeing any questions?
No hands are raised.
Would someone like to make a motion to accept the
Chris Savage did just throw up his hand. I'm not sure if it's for a motion or a question.
I'm sorry, who was that?
Chris Savage.
Chris Savage, go ahead.
Can you hear me okay? I was having a hard time getting unmuted.
No, we hear you.
Okay, actually a question on the alternative management plans, a question for Ken. If I understand correctly, South Carolina and Georgia mainly, and I guess Florida too, will be looking at recreational surveys such as MRIP and other creel surveys to detect any positive harvests over a 3-year period to see if they need to take action. Was there any discussion by the TC over river herring being a very rare event species in any of these surveys, so they may not pick up any positive harvest, and also that MRIP doesn't cover the range of where river herring might be harvested by recreational fisheries in these rivers?
Hi, yeah, thanks for your question. Yeah, we certainly did discuss those things. As you pointed out, the MRIP geographic range is limited to tribal areas. You know, folks are acutely aware of that. In terms of the recreational creel surveys, we didn't get into specifically what their creel clerks are asking. I guess the assumption was that as a creel survey, they would be detecting whatever was angled, what species were angled. So, you know, again, the limitations of MRIP were understood. And then depending on which state you're talking about, there were other additional roving surveys that I mentioned for some of the states that occur that they felt would provide some ability to detect a positive occurrence.
Okay, does that answer your question, Chris?
Yeah, that'll work. Thanks.
Okay.
This is Caitlin. I'd just like to cut in 1 second, Mike, before we take motions, and we can continue with questions, but we do have an AP report that needs to be presented, so just letting you know.
All right. So why don't we move right into that?
Maya, you can give me back the, okay, you can, yeah, change slides for us. Thank you.
Okay, Caitlin, this is Pam. Should I go?
I think you're all set.
Okay. Thank you, Mr. Chairman, members of the board. It's a pleasure to be with you, albeit virtually. It's been a while since we've had an AP meeting, so I'm glad to present our report today. And you can go to the next slide, please, Caitlin. All right, so our advisory panel met via webinar and conference call on April 8th to review the state proposals for resolving the inconsistencies with amendments 2 and 3. And the materials that we used for our meeting is we had a March 17th memo summarizing the state proposals and the TC recommendations. And also we were given well in advance of our webinar the proposals submitted by Maine, New Hampshire, Delaware, North Carolina, South Carolina, Georgia, and Florida. And we were sent those again electronically, so we had plenty of time to review those. We had 6 AP members attend the webinar representing Maine, Massachusetts, New York, New Jersey, and North Carolina. And I'll just say that 6 actually represents 50% of our AP membership. And so we do have some states where we do not have representation currently on the advisory panel. And since I have the mic, I'll just do a plug for getting some representatives to join our panel. Okay, and then the AP did provide comments on the individual state proposals and also the TC recommendations regarding the additional improvements to the FMP. Next slide, please. So there was general agreement among the AP members to support the TC recommendations for improving both the state plans and the FMP.
I see. I mean, they've already got a guy in a bucket truck over on Westview.
Seems to be somebody needing to mute there. Okay, so there was general agreement among the AP members to support the TC recommendations for improving both the state plans and the FMP as a whole. A question was raised about whether catch and release mortality rate estimates are available, as this is certainly important to consider if we're encouraging catch and release of recreational fisheries without a sustainable fishery management plan. There was one member who expressed concern about the South Carolina plan and why there was not data available in the proposal we saw after 2015. Since then, there was additional communications that explained that that has to do with the sustainability metric that's used. And so we understood that, but just would have liked to have seen more recent data. And then for Georgia and Florida, there was a concern raised by an AP member that the aggregate creel limits may pose issues because the Alosa species are not easy to distinguish, and that education should be provided to anglers to differentiate between the species. Next slide. Oh. There we go. Okay, so the alternative management plans or regimes, as discussed earlier, they actually sparked a pretty robust discussion among our AP. So again, these are alternative management programs are for rivers or river systems without a sustainable fishery management program, but they are not requiring catch and release for recreational fisheries. And this is for river, primarily for river herring. So one member felt that rather than moratoriums for rivers without sustainable fishery management plans, a small personal harvest should be permitted for recreational fishermen. And another member added that he would be in favor of this if it was biologically possible. Other AP members were concerned that the alternative management programs were not consistent with the goals of management or fair to other states that have implemented required catch and release regulations. And as one member summarized, the idea of the fisheries being open, unmanaged, and uncounted seems problematic. Our AP member from New York relayed that fishermen in his state understood the closures because they were concerned about the resource. There is a need to rebuild before we consider how many fish people should be allowed to take. And our AP member from Maine explained how they are leveraging the desire of some communities to take fish in order to restore the resource. He said the TC could recommend that some fisheries be reopened if more data is collected, and that this could fill data gaps along the coast. Next slide. And so this led to just some general overarching comments. There is a connection between personal harvest and stewardship that should be recognized, and this was a big theme of our discussion. Historically, shad and river herring were culturally important, and people took care of their runs because the runs generated food, jobs, and revenue for the town. The generation that used to eat river herring is dying out, and the focus has shifted to protecting river herring as part of the food chain for other species, and that's certainly recognized as an important benefit, but I think the point was made because it's a more removed benefit than the personal experience of capturing a fish and handling it. And then our goal should be to bring river herring and shad populations back to a place where they can be harvested and serve their role in the ecosystem. The ASMFC has a duty to incentivize more data collection for river herring and reconnect people with fish through education and citizen science. And then finally, additional guidance on the alternative management plans could be more specific on incentivizing data collection in exchange for providing for a low level of personal harvest. And I believe that concludes our comments from the AP. And I just mentioned that our full report is behind the supplemental materials.
Thank you, Pam. Any questions from the board for Pam? Tony, any hands?
Sorry, I thought I was not on mute. No, no questions yet.
All right.
I see Emerson's hand up, or maybe not anymore.
Emerson, did you have a comment?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I was going to make a motion to accept the management plans when you're ready for that motion.
Okay. Caitlin, the motion that started to be up there, would that cover the alternative plans and the sustainable fishery plans?
I think it would need to be made a little more specific if you wanted it to only cover the SFMP and state proposals that were not alternative plans. This, I think, could cover all of them. So if there's a desire to do them separately, I think that this would need to be more specific.
Well, why don't we leave it broad? I think New Hampshire we will handle separately. So this includes the alternative plans and the SFMP modifications. Would anyone like to make that motion for discussion?
Lynn Fagley has her hand raised.
Lynn, you are making that motion. Thank you. Lynn Fagley.
And Spud Woodward has his hand up as a seconder, I believe.
Excellent. Seconded by Spud Woodward.
And then Emerson, I think, has his hand up for a question, maybe, or a comment.
Okay. Go ahead, Emerson.
Yeah, no, I had my hand up, and as I mentioned before, I was ready to make that motion when the chair was ready, but
oh, right. I'm sorry.
It's already been made and seconded, so I'm fine.
Yeah, that's my fault, Emerson. Yeah. So anyway, any discussion? Would Lynn or Spud need to say anything about this?
No discussion from me, thank you. This is Lynn Begley.
Yeah. Okay.
You do have Chris Bat-Savage.
Chris Bat-Savage, go ahead.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Yeah, I think I could support the motion for approving all of these. I just, want to raise my concerns with just how the alternative management plan is written in the amendment. I think the AP brought up some good points as far as, it's not really a level playing field for states that that have SFMPs and you do the monitoring to make sure their fisheries are sustainable and don't open fisheries that they don't have the available data. It almost incentivizes states not to collect as much information, quite frankly. And when you consider that river herring is kind of always just, a few steps away from potentially being listed as threatened or endangered on the endangered species list, I think I would hope the TC works to and PDT works to kind of firm up what's allowed in alternative management plans in the future. Thanks.
Thank you, Chris. Good comment. Any other comments? Tony?
We have Megan Ware, and then Emerson, your hand is still up, so I'm not sure if you are left over from before or
not. Megan, go ahead.
Thanks, Mr. Chairman. I think it would just be helpful for me if one of the states with the adaptive management plans could just speak a little bit to the development of that and why they didn't go with catch and release. I mean, if there doesn't appear to be recreational harvest now, I'm just trying to understand the state's thought process. I think that might be helpful. Thank you.
Give Spud Woodward with his hand up, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. Go ahead, Spud.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Yeah, I can speak to Georgia's approach on this. I've said this before in board meetings that, when we go before decision-making bodies at our respective states do things on behalf of the commission, it's always important that they see the necessity and the legitimacy of doing it. If we were to request our Board of Natural Resources to promulgate catch and release regulations for a species that is functionally absent from a river system, then it calls to question some of what we do here at the commission. We feel confident that we have data collection processes in place that are going to detect the occurrence of these species if they do become something other than functionally absent. And so we think we're consistent with the spirit of the plan and the intent of the plan to make sure that we do adequately manage river herring, if they do occur with any frequency and abundance, that we will capture that in our data collection process. We have roving creel surveys independent of embryo. So we're covering the range or possible range of distribution of these species in these river systems. So that's just, the Georgia perspective.
Thank you, Spud. Are there any other alternative plans who want to comment?
I don't see any hands raised.
Okay. Any other questions, comments on the motion?
I do not see any hands.
All right. Again, we'll try for consensus. Are there any no votes?
I don't see any hands for no votes.
All right. Seeing none, you will consider the motion passed by consensus. Okay. So I think we need to address the Hampshire situation. Cherie, Do you have a motion?
Yes, I do. Thank you. Can you bring it up, Maya? So I move to approve New Hampshire's request for an exemption for their river herring SFMP requirement to close the fishery in 2020 based on data indicating that passage counts for the most recent 3-year average did not meet the sustainability target of 72,450 fish. This exemption is based on explanatory information supporting the claim that passage counts are low due to equipment failure and other variables rather than true fish passage counts or numbers. So if I can get a second, I can delve into that further.
Is there a second?
We have Roy Miller.
We have second by Roy Miller.
Thank you, Roy. So we have been struggling with a couple of our fish passage places in 2 river systems. One of them we've been trying to modify in order to address a hydro development facility that continually adjusts the impoundment levels. And so far, that's not working out really well. We thought we had it resolved this spring, but due to the flows that really didn't come through this spring, the modifications we made still were not passing the amount of fish that we should be passing in the Cocheco. As for our second river system, we had a dam removal project there, and we were hoping to continue to monitor the fish passage at the next dam in Fish Ladder. However, it seems as though the fish that are bypassing or going through the former dam site are not making it up to the other fish ladder. They're dropping out and doing their spawning below that. So we're not getting a really good count of what is going past that former dam site that had a fish ladder where we were accounting for those fish in that river system. So the 2020, we had moved this past the TC. They agreed that, due to circumstances, that they were okay with us not closing the fishery in 2020. And it so happens that it's a moot point now. We didn't close the fishery in 2020. The fishery is done. It pretty much goes from April through June. But based on us still running into problems with these 2 river systems, and our fish passage counts are still below the sustainability target, that we will be closing our season in 2021 in order to be able to thoroughly address our concerns and get fish up into these systems that are low producing at this point in time. Does anybody have any questions?
Questions for Cherie? Comments? All right, I assume there are none.
So, Mr. Chairman, this is Lynn Fegley. I raised my hand. I do have a question.
Oh, Tony's completely dropping the ball. Sorry. Go ahead, Lynn.
Yeah, no, that's fine. Cherie, just so that I'm clear and I didn't miss it. So the 2020 fishery, which is what this motion is about, is already essentially over. And you are planning on closing the fishery in 2021, is that correct?
That's correct.
Awesome, thank you.
All right, thank you. So I guess we'll move the motion. We'll try to do it by consensus. Are there any objections to the motion?
I Do not see any hand raised in objection.
Thank you. Then the motion passes by consensus.
Thank you very much.
All right. Let me look at, so I think we have the major items done. And we just have a couple of short updates and elect a vice chair. So we're going to stay the course. It'll probably take 10 or 15 more minutes. Thank you for all your forbearance. So Caitlin, could you update us on the tube?
Yes, I can. Can everyone see my screen now?
Yes.
Okay. All right. So these will be very fast. I just have one quick update on the tube. Well, two quick updates on the tube, and then a quick update on Shad habitat management plans. For the tube, just want to give a little bit of background since we haven't discussed it in a while, but this group was formed in 2014 as a joint effort between NOAA Fisheries and ASMFC, and it was kind of in response to the 2013 determination that listing river herring under the ESA was not warranted. So when that determination was made, the two bodies agreed to develop a long-term dynamic conservation plan for river herring and formed the tube with the purpose of informing that conservation plan and identifying the critical data gaps and research needs that are hindering river herring recovery. So the tube produced a few white papers focusing on different areas like river herring genetics, climate change impacts, fisheries, et cetera. And those were supposed to serve as the foundation for the conservation plan. That plan was considered completed in 2015, but it didn't exactly realize what the vision was, which was kind of a comprehensive document synthesizing all of that information into one place. So after producing those white papers, which were, put online on a web format, the tube working group and subgroups kind of stalled without having a real clear purpose or deliverable to produce. But the group as a whole has continued meeting twice a year, and these meetings have kind of transitioned from a work focus to more of a information exchange format among river herring experts. And over the last several meetings, we've gotten a sense from the participants that there is still an interest in having a more actionable document to guide river herring conservation efforts along the coast. And fortunately, NOAA Fisheries has recently secured some funding to have a contractor go back and try to update and rework that conservation plan from 2015 into something more comprehensive and informative to managers. So NOAA Fisheries has outlined the scope of work for this contract, which is supposed to start in early 2021. And the project is expected to produce something like that comprehensive document that provides a framework, goals, and objectives for river herring restoration throughout their range based on expert opinions. And I guess now is a good time to note that we're trying to move away from calling it a conservation plan because the document would not be requiring the states or NOAA to implement any actions, but would rather provide managers with updated information on the current threats, existing federal and state management actions, data and research needs, and expert recommendations for conservation and restoration efforts aimed at river herring recovery. And in general, the goal of this document would be to promote collaboration of river herring practitioners from different fields, support priority setting, and provide recommended actions for conservation and restoration of river herring throughout the range. So that's an update on tube work. And then another update is that the coordinators, being Shad McDermott from NOAA Fisheries and myself, have discussed changing the name of the group to better reflect the change in function from that work group format to more of an information exchange format. So we've had good attendance and positive feedback from participants on this new meeting format, as well as the potential name change. And after discussing a few options, we're focusing on the name Atlantic Coast River Herring Collaborative Forum, or River Herring Forum for short. And so today, just wanted to get the board's feedback on these two updates and determine if there's general agreement among the board members on the focus of the contract work that I described and the potential renaming of the tube. I'm happy to take questions and comments at this meeting, or I could also have follow-up emails if board members have additional thoughts they'd like to add or would like more information on either of these things. And I also think NOAA staff discussing with them, they'd be open to having a more detailed discussion on the focus and product of the contract work at a future meeting if there's a desire from the board. So with that, I guess I will open it up to questions or any quick comments that folks might have.
Questions or comments for Caitlin, keeping in mind that there can be follow-up conversations also.
Mike, I do not see any hands raised.
All right, seeing that, let's move on. Caitlin, can you talk about the Shad habitat plan timeline?
Yes. So yes, this update is about those American Shad habitat plans, which I'll just remind you are required under Amendment 3. So all states and jurisdictions must submit a habitat plan for American Shad. And we discussed this at the last meeting and in February, and the board asked the states to update those habitat plans since it's been about 5 years since they were originally submitted. So with the exception of the Merrimack and Hudson rivers, these would just be updates to the information that's already been put together, but the Merrimack and Hudson rivers do not have management plans currently. And the states did begin the process of reviewing those plans earlier this year. However, as you can imagine, with everything going on in the world right now and COVID-19, many of the TC members have indicated to me that they've encountered delays, and it's unlikely that any states will be able to complete updates of their plans in time for the October 2020 meeting. So considering that, my recommendation is that the states should aim to update their plans and submit new plans for the Hudson and Merrimack in time for consideration at the winter 2021 ASNSC meeting. So if the board is okay with that plan, we would expect the states to submit plans to the TC for review in December at the latest, so that the board could then consider them in February. And that's all I have on that issue.
All right, so we could do a motion on this to allow extra time. I don't think we need to. I think just a head nod would be okay given the circumstances. So does anyone have any heartburn with extending the timeline a little bit for the completion of the habitat plans?
You have Bill Hyatt with his hand up.
Go ahead, Bill.
Yeah, no heartburn. This is just a real quick question. I was just wondering if these habitat plans include passage dam removals, those types of items, if that's part of the of what's included.
Yeah, I can send around an outline, but the information is in Amendment 3, and it does include things like restoration efforts, dam removals, passage additions, and things like that. So we would want to get updates from the states on additional projects that have gone on during the last 5 years since these were implemented. These plans were implemented.
Very good. Thank you.
Okay. Any other comments?
I do not see any other hands raised, Mike. And I agree, we don't need a motion to delay.
Okay. All right. We will consider that a group nod, and we'll see those plans in January, I guess. All right. We have one remaining item. As far as I can tell, well, two with other business. So we need to elect a vice chair, a critical action. Would anyone like to make a motion to nominate someone?
We have Ray Kane.
Ray Kane. Go ahead, please.
Yes, Dr. Armstrong. I would like to nominate Dr. Justin Davis of the state of Connecticut as vice chair.
Thank you for that motion. Do we have a seconder?
Dennis Abbott.
Thank you, Dennis. Seconded by Dennis Abbott. Any discussion?
No hands.
Seeing none, the motion carries by consensus. Congratulations, Justin. Which brings us to other business. Does anyone have any other business?
I do not see any hands.
All right. Again, I really want to thank the Stock Assessment Committee and the Review Committee. That was an awesome job, and we've got a lot to do with the stocks that still remain in pretty tough shape. So with that, we'll look to the future, and this meeting's adjourned.